In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a cryptic rune stone arrives at Miss Jane Marple's doorstep, its ancient carvings whispering of a cursed Viking horde buried beneath sacred ground. Why her? Who sent it? As shadows stalk her every move, Miss Marple deciphers clues hidden in gravestones, secret journals, and forgotten manners, unraveling a web of betrayal spun by a secret society guarding the treasure's deadly power. From midnight churchyards to ancient rituals, each step pulls her deeper into danger. Will she outwit the watchful guardians, or become their next victim? A tale of wit, courage, and secrets etched in stone unfolds, where every rune holds a question, and only Miss Marple can find the answers. Chapter 1. The runestone letteth a morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a gauzy veil that softened the edges of its quaint cottages and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlour window, sipped her tea, her sharp eyes scanning the familiar scene. The roses in her garden nodded under the weight of dew, and the distant chime of the church clock marked 9 o'clock with its usual precision. It was a morning like any other, or so it seemed, until the postman's bicycle rattled to a stop outside her gate. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her fingers brushing the delicate lace of her doily. She rose, her movements measured but sprightly for a woman of her years, and peered through the lace curtains. Young Tom, the postman, was fumbling with something in his satchel, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested more than the usual bills and circulars. Curiosity, that old companion of hers, stirred in her chest. She smoothed her cardigan and opened the front door just as Tom reached the step. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying the cheerful lilt of youth. "Got something peculiar for you today. Not your usual sort of post." He held out a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper, tied with coarse twine. It was no larger than a book, but its weight was evident in the way Tom's hand dipped slightly as he offered it. "Peculiar, you say?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she took the package, noting its odd heft. "Thank you, Tom. I trust you're keeping well." "Oh, miss. Though this one gave me the shivers. No sender's name. And it's got these queer markings on it." He gestured vaguely at the package before tipping his cap and pedaling off, leaving Miss Marple standing in her doorway, the mist curling round her ankles. She closed the door and returned to her parlour, settling into her armchair with the package on her lap. The brown paper was unremarkable, save for a series of angular symbols scratched into one corner. They were not letters, not in any alphabet she recognized, but they had a deliberate, almost ritualistic quality. Her fingers traced the twine, and she hesitated, a faint prickle of unease at the base of her neck. Miss Marple was not one for superstition, but she had learned to trust her instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of village life. With a decisive tug, she untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside was a flat, smooth stone, no larger than a saucer, its surface etched with more of those strange symbols. They were carved deeply, as if by a steady hand wielding a sharp tool, and they seemed to glow faintly in the morning light filtering through the window. Beneath the stone was a folded note, its edges yellowed and crisp, as though it had been tucked away for decades before finding its way to her. Miss Marple unfolded the note with care, her eyes narrowing as she read the words scrawled in a bold, uneven hand. To the keenest mind in St. Mary Mead, the runes speak of a treasure lost to time, buried where the faithful rest. Seek the stone that weeps, and let the key guide you. Beware the shadows that guard the hoard, for they are ever watchful. There was no signature, no hint of the sender's identity, only those cryptic words and the weight of the rune stone in her hand. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind already turning over the possibilities. A treasure buried in the village? It was the sort of thing that might excite a younger person. But Miss Marple was not so easily swayed by promises of wealth. What intrigued her was the puzzle itself, the runes, the anonymous sender, the mention of shadows. Someone had gone to great lengths to craft this message, and she intended to find out why. She rose and carried the stone to her writing desk, where she kept a magnifying glass for examining fine print or the occasional curious artifact. Under the lens, the runes revealed their intricacy, sharp angles, and looping curves, some resembling letters, others more like symbols of forgotten meaning. They were beautiful, in a stark, ancient way, and they stirred a memory of a conversation long ago with Professor Hargreaves, her old friend from Oxford days. He had been an archaeologist, specializing in Norse history, and had once shown her a Viking brooch inscribed with similar marks. If anyone could shed light on these runes, it was he. Miss Marple wrapped the stone carefully in a soft cloth and tucked the note into her handbag. She donned her coat and hat, choosing the sensible navy one with the small feather, and set out for the village post office, where she could telephone Professor Hargreaves. The mist was lifting now, revealing the familiar contours of St. Mary. Mead, the butcher's shop with its cheerful red awning, the bakery emitting the warm scent of fresh bread, the children skipping along the lane to school. Yet today, the village seemed to hum with a subtle undercurrent, as if it, too, sensed the mystery in her hands. At the post office, Mrs. Cleary, the postmistress, greeted her with a nod and a smile. Morning, Miss Marple. Off to solve another mystery, are we? Her tone was teasing, but her eyes lingered on the handbag, as if she sensed its contents were more than the usual knitting or correspondence. Just a small errand, Mrs. Cleary, Miss Marple replied, her smile mild but unrevealing. She stepped into the telephone booth, closing the glass door behind her, and dialed the number she knew by heart. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered, gravelly with age but warm with recognition. Jane, my dear, it's been too long. What brings you to trouble an old scholar? Professor Hargreaves's voice carried the faint crackle of a fire in the background, suggesting he was in his study, surrounded by his beloved books and artifacts. I've come across something curious, Harold, Miss Marple said, keeping her voice low. A stone inscribed with runes, and a note hinting at a treasure in St. Mary Mead. I thought you might help me make sense of it. Runes, you say? His tone sharpened with interest. Norse, perhaps? Bring it over, Jane. I'm in my cottage at Chipping Cleghorn, not far from you. We'll have a look together. Miss Marple agreed, promising to visit that afternoon, and hung up the receiver. She stepped out of the booth, her mind already mapping the journey to Chipping Cleghorn. But as she left the post office, a shadow caught her eye, a man standing across the street, half hidden by the butcher's awning. He was tall, with a dark coat and a hat pulled low, and though she couldn't see his face, she felt the weight of his gaze. He turned and vanished down an alley before she could study him further. But the encounter left a chill in her bones. The journey to Chipping Cleghorn was a pleasant one. The train rattling through fields golden with late summer wheat. Miss Marple sat by the window, the runestone wrapped securely in her handbag, and let her thoughts wander. The note's mention of a stone that weeps suggested a gravestone, perhaps one in the churchyard where water might pool or moss might grow, giving the appearance of tears. The key, though, puzzled her. The note implied it was literal, not metaphorical. But no key had been included in the package. Was it hidden elsewhere, waiting to be found? Professor Hargreaves's cottage was a charming, ivy-covered affair, its garden overflowing with wildflowers and herbs. He greeted her at the door, his white hair tousled, his glasses perched precariously on his nose. "Come in, come in. Let's see this treasure of yours." They settled in his cluttered study, where shelves groaned under the weight of books and artifacts. Miss Marple unwrapped the stone and placed it on the desk, watching as Hargreaves's eyes lit up. He adjusted his glasses and leaned close, muttering to himself as he traced the runes with a trembling finger. "Norse, without a doubt," he said at last. "Elder Futhark, to be precise. Used by the Vikings around the 2nd to 4th centuries. These runes tell a story, Jane, but they're not easy to read without context. This one here," he pointed to a jagged symbol resembling a lightning bolt, "is Soilo, the sun, often a sign of victory or guidance. And this," he indicated a diamond-shaped rune, "is Ingwas, linked to fertility or completion. But the full meaning, I'd need time to translate properly." And the note. Miss Marple handed him the folded paper, watching his expression shift from curiosity to concern as he read. "This is no ordinary prank," he said, his voice low. "The Viking hoard of St. Mary Mead is a legend among historians. It said a chieftain buried his wealth here in the 9th century, protected by a curse to ward off thieves. Most thought it a myth, but this stone, it's authentic, Jane." And the note's tone suggests someone believes the hoard is Reland close. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The note mentions a stone that weeps and a key. "I suspect the churchyard is the place to start. There's a gravestone there, old, unweathered, with a hollow that collects rainwater. It's known locally as the Weeping Stone." Hargreaves chuckled, a spark of admiration in his eyes. "You haven't changed a bit, Jane. Always 3 steps ahead, if you're right. The key might be hidden there, but be cautious. If this hoard exists, others may be after it, and they won't all be as polite as you." They spent the afternoon poring over the stone, Hargreaves sketching the runes and promising to send a full translation in a few days. Miss Marple left the cottage as dusk settled, the runestone safely in her handbag, her thoughts buzzing with possibilities The train ride back to St. Mary Mead was quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced out the window, half expecting to see the man in the dark coat, but the platform was empty. Back in the village, the churchyard was her next destination. The moon was rising, casting silver light over the gravestones as she slipped through the lych gate, her footsteps muffled by the grass. The weeping stone stood near the church's north wall, an ancient slab tilted slightly, its surface stained with moss and watermarks. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers probing the base where the stone met the earth. The ground was soft, recently disturbed, and her heart quickened as she uncovered a small metal box buried shallowly beneath. With a glance around to ensure she was alone, she pried open the box. Inside was a single key, its bronze surface etched with a single rune matching one on the stone. It was heavy, ornate, and unmistakably old, its craftsmanship suggesting a purpose beyond the ordinary. Miss Marple slipped it into her pocket, a quiet thrill coursing through her. The mystery was unfolding, and though she sensed danger lurking in the shadows, she felt alive with the challenge as she stood. A rustle in the nearby yew trees made her freeze. Her eyes scanned the darkness, catching a fleeting movement. A figure, perhaps the man from earlier, retreating into the night. She clutched the key tightly, her mind already planning her next steps. The runestone, the note, the key, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. For now, she had the key, and with it, the promise of answers. She left the churchyard, her heart light with the satisfaction of a mystery begun, and the certainty that she was on the right path. Chapter 2. Shadows in the churchyard night was thick with the scent of damp earth and honeysuckle, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that only a small village like St. Mary Mead could muster. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of her garden, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the ornate key from the churchyard gravestone clutched in her gloved hand. The moon hung low, a pale crescent casting faint silver light over the cobblestone path that led to the village church. It was nearing midnight, and the world seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew she was about to step into the unknown. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite her age, scanned the quiet lane. She had always believed that night revealed truths daylight could not. The anonymous letter, with its cryptic Norse runes, had set her mind alight with curiosity. Professor Hargreaves' translation had been clear enough. The runes spoke of a Viking horde, buried centuries ago, hidden beneath the sacred ground of St. Mary Mead's churchyard. The key she now held, unearthed from a hidden compartment in a weathered gravestone, was the first tangible proof that the letter was no prank. It was heavy, wrought from iron, its handle intricately carved with swirling patterns that echoed the runes. It felt ancient, purposeful, and faintly ominous. She adjusted her hat, a practical felt affair, and stepped onto the path. Her footsteps were soft, deliberate, the faint crunch of gravel muffled by years of practice in moving unnoticed. St. Mary Mead was a place of predictable rhythms: tea at 4, gossip at the post office, Sunday sermons, but tonight it felt different. The village seemed to watch her, its windows dark, its chimneys silent, Miss Marple's lips curved into a small, determined smile. She was no stranger to secrets, and this one, she sensed, was worth pursuing. The churchyard gate creaked as she pushed it open, the sound sharp in the stillness. The ancient yew trees loomed like sentinels, their branches casting jagged shadows across the uneven ground. The gravestones, some tilted with age, stood in orderly rows, their inscriptions worn, but legible under the moonlight. Miss Marple moved with purpose, her memory of the runestone letter guiding her to the gravestone where she had found the key. It was a plain slab, unremarkable save for the faint runic markings etched into its base, barely visible unless one knew where to look. She knelt, her knees protesting slightly, and ran her fingers along the stone's edge. The compartment where she had found the key had been cleverly concealed, its seams blended into the natural cracks of the stone. Now she sought another clue, something the letter had hinted at, a vessel of guidance buried beneath the earth. Her gloved hands brushed away loose soil, revealing a small, rusted iron ring embedded in the ground. She tugged gently, and to her satisfaction, a square of turf lifted like a trapdoor, exposing a shallow cavity. Inside lay a small wooden box, its surface blackened with age but sturdy. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She glanced around, her senses alert, but the churchyard remained still. She inserted the key into the box's lock, and with a satisfying click, it opened. Nestled within was a folded piece of vellum, its edges brittle but intact. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a map, its lines drawn in faded ink. The map depicted St. Mary Mead's churchyard and the surrounding countryside, with a winding path marked in red that led to the outskirts of the village, where the old Haverford manor stood, abandoned for decades. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Haverford Manor was a place of local legend, whispered about by children and avoided by adults. Its crumbling walls and overgrown gardens were said to harbor ghosts. Though Miss Marple had little patience for such nonsense, ghosts were merely stories, but maps were facts. She traced the path with her finger, noting landmarks, the old oak by the mill, the bridge over the stream, the stile at the edge of the meadow. The map was precise, purposeful, and she felt a thrill of anticipation. This was no idle treasure hunt. Someone, long ago, had gone to great lengths to hide something. As she folded the map and tucked it into her handbag, a faint rustle broke the silence. Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. The sound came from the copse of trees at the churchyard's edge, where the shadows were deepest. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate, and peered into the darkness. The moonlight caught the glint of something eyes, perhaps, or the sheen of a blade. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice steady but soft, as if addressing a nervous cat. No answer came, but the rustle repeated. Closer now. Miss Marple's mind raced. She was alone, unarmed, save for her wits, and the churchyard was far from any house. Yet she was not afraid, not yet. She had faced worse than shadows in her time. From jealous husbands to scheming maids, she took a step toward the trees, her handbag clutched tightly, the map and key safe inside. "If you're lost, I can help." "You find your way," she said, her tone grandmotherly but laced with steel. The shadows shifted, and a figure emerged, cloaked in darkness. It was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the cautious grace of someone who did not wish to be seen. Miss Marple's eyes caught the outline of a coat, the brim of a hat pulled low. The figure paused, as if weighing whether to approach or flee. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it melted back into the trees, leaving only the faint crunch of leaves in its wake. Miss Marple stood still, her breath steady. She was not one to imagine things, and she was certain she had been watched. The question was why. The letter, the key, the map, they were pieces of a puzzle, and someone else was playing the game. She turned back to the churchyard gate, her steps brisk but unhurried. There was no need to run. Running suggested fear, and Miss Marple was not afraid. Not yet. Back at her cottage, she locked the door and drew the curtains. Before spreading the map on her dining table, the fire in the hearth cast a warm glow, and a cup of tea steamed beside her, its fragrance calming her nerves. She studied the map, her knitting needles idle for once, her mind wholly absorbed. The path to Haverford Manor was clear, but the manor itself was a mystery. It had been built in the 17th century by a wealthy merchant, only to fall into ruin. After a series of misfortunes, fires, bankruptcies, and, if village gossip was to be believed, a curse. Miss Marple dismissed the curse as fanciful, but the map suggested otherwise. Someone had hidden something there, something worth guarding with runes and secrets. She sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to the figure in the churchyard. Whoever they were, they had not attacked her, which suggested caution rather than malice. A thief would have acted, a spy would have stayed hidden. This was someone curious, perhaps as curious as she was. She made a mental note to ask Dolly Bantry, her friend and the village's most reliable source of gossip, about any strangers in St. Mary Mead. Dolly would know. Dolly always knew. The clock struck one, its chimes soft but insistent. Miss Marple folded the map and placed it in a locked drawer, along with the key. She would visit Haverford Manor tomorrow, in daylight, when shadows were less likely to lurk. For now, she needed rest, though her mind buzzed with possibilities. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she paused at the window, peering out. At the darkened lane, the village was silent, but she felt the weight of unseen eyes. Someone was watching, and she was determined to find out who. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made St. Mary Mead look like a postcard. Miss Marple, dressed in a sensible tweed coat and sturdy shoes, set out. For Haverford Manor, the map was tucked into her handbag, along with a notebook and pencil for jotting down observations. She took the long route, passing through the village square to gauge the mood of St. Mary Mead. The post office was abuzz with chatter about a new delivery boy, and the bakery smelled of fresh scones, but no one mentioned runes or hoards. That was as it should be. Secrets, Miss Marple knew, thrived in silence. The path to the manor wound through fields and over a rickety stile, the countryside unfolding in patches of gold and green. She paused at the old oak by the mill, its gnarled branches heavy with acorns, The map marked it as a waypoint, and she noted a faint carving on its trunca rune, similar to those on the letter. She sketched it in her notebook, her fingers steady despite the chill. The rune was angular, like a lightning bolt crossed with a spear, and it sent a shiver through her. Not of fear, but of excitement. This was a trail, and she was following it. Haverford Manor came into view as she crested a hill, its silhouette stark against the sky. The once grand house was a ruin, its windows shattered, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders. Ivy choked the walls, and the gardens were a tangle of brambles and nettles. Miss Marple approached cautiously, her eyes scanning for signs of life. The map indicated an entrance at the rear, hidden behind a collapsed arbor. She circled the manor, her shoes sinking into the damp earth, and found the arbor, its wooden frame splintered but still standing. The entrance was a low door, half hidden by ivy. She pushed it open, wincing at the groan of rusted hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty scent of decay. The manor's interior was a labyrinth of crumbling plaster and broken furniture, the remnants of its former glories scattered like bones. Miss Marple moved slowly, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The map led her to the great hall, where a massive fireplace dominated the far wall, its mantel carved with faded hunting scenes. She studied the fireplace, her fingers tracing the carvings. The map marked a hidden heart, and she suspected it referred to a secret compartment. She pressed the carvings, testing for movement. Her patience rewarded when a panel clicked and slid aside, revealing a narrow passage. Her heart quickened, but she hesitated. The passage was dark, its walls damp, and she had no torch. Yet the map was clear, and she was not one to turn back. She stepped into the passage, her handbag clutched tightly. The air grew colder, the walls closing in as she descended a short flight of stone steps. At the bottom was a small chamber, its walls lined with shelves that held nothing but cobwebs. In the center stood a wooden chest, its lid carved with runes. Miss Marple's breath caught. This was it, the next piece of the puzzle. She knelt beside the chest, her fingers brushing the runes. They were different from those on the letter, more intricate, as if meant to tell a story. She opened her notebook and began sketching them, her pencil moving swiftly. As she worked, a faint sound reached her, a creak, like a footstep on the floor above. She froze, her senses alert. The creak came again, closer now, and she realized she was not alone. Miss Marple slipped into the shadows, pressing herself against the wall. The footsteps descended the stairs, slow and deliberate. A figure appeared in the chamber's entrance, their face obscured by the darkness. They carried a lantern, its light casting flickering shadows across the runes. Miss Marple held her breath, her mind racing. The figure approached the chest, their movements cautious, as if they knew its value. They knelt, just as she had, and began examining the runes. She considered her options. She could confront them, but she was unarmed and alone. She could flee, but the passage was narrow, and she risked being seen. Instead, she waited, her eyes fixed on the figure. They were tall, dressed in a long coat, their hands gloved. They muttered something under their breath, too low for her to hear. and then stood. Turning to leave, Miss Marple seized her chance. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Good evening," she said. "I see you're interested in the chest as well." The figure spun around, their lanterns swinging wildly. For a moment, their face was illuminated, a man, middle-aged, with sharp features and eyes that glinted with surprise. He recovered quickly, his expression hardening. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and rough. "Jane Marple," she replied, her tone pleasant but unyielding. "And you are—" He hesitated, then turned and bolted up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the passage. Miss Marple did not pursue. She knew better than to chase shadows. Instead, she returned to the chest, her mind cataloguing the man's face. She had seen him before, though where, she could not yet place. The chest was locked, and the key from the churchyard did not fit. She made a mental note to return with tools, but for now, she had what she came for: confirmation that the map was real, and that others were hunting the same prize. She retraced her steps to the manor's entrance, her heart light despite the encounter. The runes, the chest, the shadowy figure, they were threads in a tapestry, and she was beginning to see its pattern as she stepped into the daylight. She glanced back at the manor, its walls silent but full of secrets. She would return, and next time she would be prepared. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open. She sketched the man's face, her memory sharp despite the brief glimpse. He was no villager. His clothes were too fine, his manner too guarded. She sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to the chest. The runes suggested a story, perhaps a warning, and she resolved to consult Professor Hargreaves again. For now, she was content. The map had led her to the manor, and the manor had given her a new clue. The game was afoot, and Miss Marple was ready to play. The days that followed were a blur of quiet investigation. Miss Marple visited Dolly Bantry, who confirmed that a stranger had been seen in the village, a man in a long coat, asking questions about the churchyard. Dolly's gossip was a treasure trove, and Miss Marple filed away every detail. She also wrote to Professor Hargreaves, enclosing her sketches of the runes. His reply arrived swiftly, confirming that the runes on the chest were rare dialect, possibly linked to a Viking chieftain who had settled in the area centuries ago. The chest, he suggested, might contain a record of the hoard's true location. Miss Marple prepared for her return to the manor, her handbag now equipped with a small crowbar and a torch. She chose a foggy morning when the village was cloaked in mist to avoid prying eyes. The manor was as she had left it, its silence oppressive. She descended to the chamber, her torch casting a steady beam. The chest was untouched, its runes gleaming under the light. She set to work, prying open the lid with the crowbar. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact. She opened it, her eyes scanning the faded script. It was written in English, dated 1823, by a vicar named Elias Hawthorne. The journal detailed his discovery of the Viking hoard and his decision to hide it. Fearing its power would corrupt the village, he mentioned a secret society, the Order of the Rune, sworn to protect the hoard at all costs. The final entry was, "Cryptic. The traitor walks among us. The hoard must remain hidden, lest its curse awaken." Miss Marple's heart raced. This was more than a treasure hunt. It was a conspiracy, one that had survived centuries. She tucked the journal into her handbag and made her way out of the manor, her steps quick but silent. As she emerged into the fog, she heard a twig snap behind her. She turned, her torch sweeping the mist, but saw nothing. Yet she knew, with the certainty of experience, that she was being followed. She returned home, locking the door behind her. The journal lay open on her table, its secrets waiting to be unraveled. She felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered by caution. The shadowy figure, the runes. The journal, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. The hoard was out there, and so was the truth. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already planning her next move, her resolve as strong as ever. Chapter 3. The manor's secret morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat at her small writing desk, the vellum map from the churchyard spread before her, its edges curling slightly as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. The map was a thing of beauty, despite its age etched in faded ink, with lines that snaked through landmarks she recognized from St. Mary Mead. At its heart was a crude sketch of the old Greystone Manor, a crumbling estate on the village's northern edge, abandoned since the last of the Greystone family had fled to London decades ago. The map's path ended there, marked by a tiny rune that Professor Hargreaves had identified as Ansu's, the Norse symbol for wisdom or revelation. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Wisdom, indeed. The manor was her next step, and she felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle taking shape. She folded the map carefully, tucking it into her handbag alongside a small torch, a notebook, and a pair of sturdy gloves, practical tools for an impractical adventure. The manor was a half-hour walk, and though the autumn air was crisp, Miss Marple donned her tweed coat and a sensible hat, her steps purposeful as she left the cottage. The village was quiet, save for the chatter of sparrows and the distant hum of a tractor in the fields. She passed Mrs. Price's bakery, where the scent of fresh scones wafted out, and waved politely to Mr. Jenkins, who was sweeping leaves from his garden path. He called out a cheerful greeting, oblivious to the weight of the mysteries she carried. The road to Greystone Manor wound past hedgerows thick with blackberries, and the occasional splash of late-blooming wildflowers. Miss Marple's mind was sharp, turning over the events of the previous night. The shadowy figure in the churchyard had unsettled her not for fear of danger, but because it confirmed her suspicion that she wasn't alone in this hunt. Someone else knew of the map, perhaps even the hoard itself. The question was who, and why they hadn't acted sooner. Her thoughts drifted to the key she'd found, its intricate carvings glinting in her memory. It had unlocked the box beneath, the gravestone, but she sensed it had more to reveal. Perhaps the manor held the answer. As she approached the manor, its silhouette loomed against the sky, a gaunt, ivy-choked structure with broken windows like empty eyes. The iron gates hung askew, creaking faintly as she pushed them open. The gravel drive was overgrown with weeds, and the air carried a damp, earthy scent, as if the manor itself were exhaling years of neglect. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her hand resting on the gatepost. The map had led her here, but maps, she knew, were only as reliable as the hands that drew them. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the churchyard. But the road was empty. With a steadying breath, she stepped forward. The front door was ajar, its wood warped and splintered. She nudged it open, wincing. At the groan of rusted hinges, the foyer was a cavern of dust and shadow, with a grand staircase spiraling upward into darkness. Cobwebs draped the chandelier, its crystals dulled by grime, and the air was thick with the musty smell of decay. Miss Marple's torch cast a narrow beam, illuminating faded portraits on the wall's stern-faced greystones staring down. Their eyes seeming to follow her, she moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by a threadbare rug, and consulted the map. A line curved from the foyer to the drawing room, then to a fireplace marked with a tiny ansus. She nodded to herself, satisfied. The fireplace was her goal, but the drawing room was a mausoleum of forgotten elegance. Heavy drapes hung in tatters, letting slivers of sunlight pierce the gloom. The fireplace dominated one wall, its marble mantel carved with vines and roses, though the hearth was cold and choked with ash. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting slightly, and examined the mantel. The map suggested a hidden mechanism, and her fingers traced the carvings. Searching for anything out of place, a faint click rewarded her patience a rosebud that pressed inward, revealing a narrow panel sliding open with a soft scrape. Behind it was a lever, rusted but intact. She pulled it, and the fireplace rumbled, shifting to expose a dark passage. Her heart quickened, not with fear, but with the quiet excitement of discovery. The passage was narrow, its walls damp and lined with moss. She stepped inside, her torch illuminating rough stone steps descending into the manor's underbelly. The air grew colder, carrying a faint metallic tang, and her footsteps echoed in the confined space. At the bottom, the passage opened into a small, circular room, its walls etched with runes that matched those on the letters she'd received. In the center stood a wooden chest, its lid inlaid with a single ansus. Miss Marple's fingers itched to open it, but she paused, her instincts whispering caution. Traps were not uncommon in such places, and the chest's pristine condition amid the manor's decay seemed too convenient. She circled the chest, her torch sweeping the room. A faint draught brushed her cheek, and she turned to find a crack in the wall, barely visible. Kneeling, she peered through it, catching a glimpse of another chamber empty, save for a pile of broken furniture. The draught suggested an exit, a detail she filed away for later. Satisfied that no immediate danger loomed, she returned to the chest and lifted the lid, its hinges creaking in protest. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact, and a small iron key, simpler than the one from the churchyard, but no less intriguing. She lifted the journal, its weight satisfying in her hands, and flipped to the first page. The handwriting was precise, dated 1847, and signed by one Reverend Elias Greystone, The opening lines spoke of a duty as sacred, charged to guard a treasure brought to St. Mary Mead by Viking raiders centuries ago. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she read of a secret society, the Order of the Rune. Formed to protect the hoard from those who sought its power, the journal hinted at a betrayal. A member who had broken a blood oath and vanished with a piece of the hoard. The final entry was cryptic. The wisdom of Ansus lies not in gold, but in the truth it guards. Seek the traitor's path, for it leads to the heart. Miss Marple closed the journal, her mind racing. The Order of the Rune was no myth, and its secrets were tied to the manor, the map, and perhaps the shadowy figure trailing her. She tucked the journal and key into her handbag, her fingers lingering on the leather cover. The room felt smaller, now, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. She retraced her steps to the passage, but a faint creak above stopped her cold. It was not the settling of an old house, but the deliberate tread of a foot on wood. Someone was. In the manor, she switched off her torch, plunging the passage into darkness, and pressed herself against the wall. The creak came again, closer now, from the drawing room. Her pulse was steady, her mind clear. She had faced danger before village gossip could be as perilous as a physical threat, and she knew the value of patience. The footsteps paused, followed by a low mutter, too faint to discern. Miss Marple edged toward the crack in the wall, her earlier discovery now a potential escape. She slipped through, emerging into the second chamber, and moved silently toward a rusted grate that led to the manor's side garden. The footsteps grew louder, descending the passage she'd just left. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the manor's musty confines. She crouched behind a tangle of ivy, watching as a figure emerged from the side door. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a scarf. He scanned the garden, his movements tense, then retreated into the manor. Miss Marple waited, counting to 100, before standing and brushing dirt from her coat. The journal was safe, the key secure, and her resolve unshaken. She had what she came for, but the encounter left a question burning in her mind. Who was he, and how did he know to follow her here? The walk back to St. Mary Mead was brisk, the journal a comforting weight in her bag. The village was stirring now, with children playing near the green and Mrs. Hartley hanging laundry in her yard. Miss Marple smiled at them, her face serene, but her thoughts were far from idle. The journal's mention of a traitor intrigued her. Betrayal was a human constant, as familiar to her as the knitting needles on her parlor table. She recalled the village's history whispers of scandal in the Greystone family, a sudden departure that left the manor empty. Could the traitor's descendants still live in St. Mary Mead? And was the shadowy figure one of them at her cottage? She brewed a pot of tea and settled into her armchair, the journal open on her lap. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow over the room, and she began to read in earnest. Reverend Greystone's entries were meticulous, detailing meetings of the order in the manor's hidden room. The hoard, he wrote, was not merely gold but a collection of artifacts, imbued with ancient power, though he dismissed such claims as superstition. The traitor, a man named Silas Thorne, had stolen a jeweled dagger, believing it held the key to the hoard's true value. The dagger's description rune-etched, with a sapphire in its hilt stuck in Miss Marple's memory. It was too specific to be coincidence. She paused, sipping her tea, and considered the order's purpose. Protecting a hoard was one thing, but a blood oath suggested fanaticism, a devotion that could survive generations. The shadowy figure's presence suggested the order was still active, or at least its remnants were. She turned to the map, tracing the path from the manor to a forested area north of the village. The journal hinted at another clue there, but the creak in the manor lingered in her mind. She would need to be cautious, perhaps even enlist help. Her nephew, Raymond, was due to visit soon, and his youthful vigor might prove useful. The afternoon passed in quiet study, the journal yielding more questions than answers. As dusk settled, Miss Marple lit a lamp and wrote notes in her neat, precise hand. The order of the rune, Silas Thorne. The jeweled dagger, all pieces of a puzzle that stretched from Viking raiders. To her own doorstep, she felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that came from untangling a knot one thread at a time. But the manor's intruder was a loose end, one she couldn't ignore. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see a shadow, but the glass reflected only her own face, calm and resolute. The next morning, she visited the village library, a small building crammed with books and overseen by Miss Clara, a spinster with a passion for local history. Miss Marple inquired about the Greystone family, her tone casual, as if merely curious about village lore. Miss Clara, delighted by the interest, produced a dusty ledger of parish records. Together, they traced the Greystone line to a single, living descendant, Eleanor Grayson, an antiques dealer who lived on the village's edge. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Grayson, not Greystone, but close enough to warrant a visit. She thanked Miss Clara and walked to Eleanor's shop, a cluttered building with a sign reading Grayson's Antiques. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and Eleanor emerged from the back, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a guarded smile. The shop was a labyrinth of old clocks, porcelain figurines, and tarnished silver. But Miss Marple's gaze settled on a pendant hanging behind the counter, rune-etched, with a sapphire glinting in its center. It matched the journal's description of the stolen dagger's hilt. Miss Grayson, Miss Marple said, her voice warm but probing. That's a lovely pendant. Quite old, I imagine. Eleanor's smile faltered, her hand brushing the pendant instinctively. Oh, a family heirloom. Nothing special. Miss Marple nodded, her expression benign, but her mind catalogued every detail. Eleanor's nervous glance, the way her fingers lingered on the sapphire. They chatted over tea, Miss Marple steering the conversation to village history. But Eleanor deflected questions about her family with practiced ease. As Miss Marple left, she noticed a man lingering across the street, his scarf pulled high despite the mild day. It was the same figure from the manor, and her pulse quickened with recognition. She didn't turn back, but her steps were measured, her mind already planning. That evening, she sat by her fire, the journal open again. The pendant was no coincidence, and Eleanor's evasiveness confirmed it. The man following her was a complication, but Miss Marple thrived on complications. She penned a letter to Raymond, asking him to arrive sooner, and tucked the journal into a locked drawer. The manor had given her a piece of the puzzle, but the hoard and its guardians remained out of reach. She leaned back, her knitting, needles clicking softly, and smiled. The game was afoot, and she was ready for its next move. Chapter 4. The traitors descend. Donthay morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat at her small writing desk, the mysterious journal from the manor opened before her, its brittle pages whispering secrets of a bygone era. The leather-bound volume, penned by a 19th-century vicar named Edmund Grayson, spoke of a secret society, a Viking horde, and a betrayal that had fractured the group's sacred trust. Miss Marple's sharp eyes traced the faded ink, her mind already turning over the implications of the words blood oath and traitor. The journal had given her a name, Grayson, and a lead to follow. Eleanor Grayson, a reclusive antiques dealer who lived on the edge of the village. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the porcelain cup warm against her fingers, and considered her next step. The rune-engraved pendant mentioned in the journal intrigued her. It was described as a silver disc, etched with a spiraling Norse symbol, a relic passed down through generations. If Eleanor was indeed a descendant of Edmund Grayson, she might possess this pendant or at least know of it. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. People, she knew, often revealed more than they intended over a cup of tea and a bit of gentle probing. She set the cup down, adjusted her shawl, and resolved to visit Eleanor's shop that afternoon. The walk to Eleanor Grayson's antiques shop took Miss Marple along the winding lanes of St. Mary Mead, where hedgerows bloomed with late summer roses, and the air carried the scent of freshly cut grass. The village was quiet, save for the distant laughter of children playing near the green, and the rhythmic clop of a horse-drawn cart delivering milk. Miss Marple's sensible shoes crunched softly on the gravel path, her mind alert to every detail. The flutter of a curtain in a cottage window, the quick glance of a passerby. She hadn't forgotten the shadowy figure who had watched her in the churchyard, nor the unease that had followed her home. Her hand tightened briefly on the handle of her umbrella, a habit born of caution rather than fear. Eleanor's shop, tucked between a bakery and a cobbler's, was a narrow building with a faded sign that read Grayson's Antiques and Curios. The windows were cluttered with an eclectic array of items: a tarnished brass lamp, a chipped porcelain shepherdess, a stack of leather-bound books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. A bell jingled as Miss Marple pushed open the door, stepping into a dimly lit room that smelled of old wood, beeswax polish, and something faintly metallic, like tarnished silver. The shop was a labyrinth of shelves and tables, each laden with relics of the past clocks that no longer ticked, faded tapestries, and glass cases filled with jewelry that glinted faintly in the low light. Eleanor Grayson emerged from behind a velvet curtain at the back of the shop, her movements slow and deliberate. She was a woman in her late 50s, tall and thin, with sharp cheekbones and graying hair pulled into a severe bun. Her eyes, a pale blue that seemed to pierce through the dimness, fixed on Miss Marple with a mix of curiosity and wariness. She wore a high-necked blouse and a long skirt, both in muted shades of grey, as if she sought to blend into the shadows of her own shop. Around her neck hung a silver chain, and Miss Marple's heart quickened as she caught a glimpse of a pendant, a disc engraved with a spiraling rune, just as the journal had described. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and unassuming, the tone of a kindly aunt inquiring about a neighbour's health. "I'm Jane Marple, from St. Mary Mead. I've heard such lovely things about your shop and thought I'd pop in to see your collection. I do so enjoy old things. There's a story in everyone, don't you think?" Eleanor's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained guarded. "Miss Marple, is it?" "Yes. I've heard of you. You're the one who solved that dreadful business with the vicar's missing silver a few years back." She gestured toward a small table near the window, where a tray held a teapot and cups. "Would you care for tea? I was just about to have some myself." "How kind of you," Miss Marple replied, settling into a cushioned chair that creaked under her weight. She noted the faint tremor in Eleanor's hand as she poured the tea, the way her eyes darted toward the pendant before returning to her guest. The shop was silent save for the distant tick of a clock, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle beginning to take shape. They spoke for a time about inconsequential things: the weather, the upcoming village fete, the difficulty of finding good help these days. Miss Marple was patient, letting Eleanor relax into the rhythm of the conversation. She admired a chipped teacup on display, asked about the provenance of a tarnished candelabra, and shared a story about her own collection of lace doilies. But, all the while, her eyes returned to the pendant, its rune catching the light with every movement Eleanor made. "That's a striking piece you're wearing," Miss Marple said at last, her tone light but deliberate. "Such an unusual design. Is it an antique, or something more personal?" Eleanor's hand flew to the pendant, her fingers closing around it as if to shield it from view. "Oh, it's just a family trinket," she said, her voice a shade too casual. "Been in the Graysons for generations. Nothing special, really." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity. "Grayson, you say?" "I believe I came across that name recently, in an old journal I found at the manor. Written by an Edmund Grayson, a vicar, I think. He mentioned a pendant, very much like yours, with a Norse rune. Fascinating, isn't it? How objects carry history." The color drained from Eleanor's face, though she recovered quickly, forcing a smile. "Edmund Grayson was my great-great-grandfather, or something like that. I don't know much about him, I'm afraid. The pendant's just a keepsake. I wear it for sentiment." She busied herself with the teapot, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled Miss Marple's cup. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "Of course," she said gently, "sentiment is so important. But it's curious, isn't it? The journal mentioned a secret society, something about a Viking horde and a blood oath. I suppose such stories grow exaggerated over time, but they do make one wonder." Eleanor's smile faltered, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of fear in the woman's eyes. "Old stories, Eleanor said, her voice tight. People love to invent mysteries about the past. I deal in antiques, Miss Marple, not fairy tales. Of course, Miss Marple said again, her tone soothing. Though I must say, the manor itself is quite a mystery. I visited it recently, such a shame it's fallen into disrepair. I found the journal in a hidden room, behind a fireplace. It made me think there might be more secrets hidden in St. Mary Mead than we realize. Eleanor's cup clattered against its saucer, and she set it down quickly. A hidden room, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You've been busy, haven't you? Oh, I'm just an old woman with too much time on her hands, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. But I do enjoy a good puzzle, and I couldn't help but notice when I was in the churchyard the other night that someone else seemed interested in my little investigations, a man watching from the trees. I don't suppose you've seen anyone lurking about, have you? Eleanor's eyes widened, and she stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt. I'm afraid I don't know anything about that, she said, her voice sharp now. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have some inventory to attend to. It was lovely to meet you. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate. Thank you for the tea, Miss Grayson. I hope I haven't taken up too much of your time. I'll be sure to stop by again. Your shop is quite a treasure trove. As she stepped outside, the bell jingling behind her, Miss Marple paused on the pavement, her eyes scanning the street. The village was as peaceful as ever, with a postman cycling past and a pair of women chatting outside the bakery. But there, at the far end of the lane, stood a man in a dark coat, his face half hidden by a low cap. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. It was the same figure from the churchyard, she was certain of it. She memorized the slant of his shoulders, the way he moved with a slight limp, and the glint of a silver watch on his wrist. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned and disappeared around a corner. Miss Marple walked home at a leisurely pace, her mind buzzing with new information. Eleanor Grayson was hiding something, that much was clear. The pendant, the journal, the nervous glances. She was no stranger to the secrets of the Viking horde. And the man in the dark coat, he was no casual observer. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the journal, tucked safely in her handbag, and she felt a familiar surge of satisfaction. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there were still gaps to be filled. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair by the fire, the journal open on her lap. She reread the passages about the secret society, the Order of the Rune, and the traitor who had broken their oath. Edmund Grayson had been a member, but his words suggested he had uncovered deceit within the group, a betrayal that had led to the horde's concealment. Was Eleanor protecting her ancestors' legacy, or was she part of something more sinister? And who was the man watching her? A descendant of another society member, perhaps, or someone with a more personal stake in the horde. The afternoon light faded into evening, and Miss Marple lit a lamp, her thoughts turning to the village, St. Mary Mead. With its quaint cottages and gossiping neighbors, was a microcosm of human nature, a place where secrets simmered beneath the surface. She thought of Mrs. Price, the postmistress, who knew everyone's business. Mr. Hodges, the butcher, who had a knack for overhearing conversations, and young Tommy Pierce, who ran errands and saw more than he let on. One of them might have seen the man in the dark coat, or heard whispers about Eleanor Grayson. Miss Marple rose and crossed to her writing desk, where she kept a small notebook for jotting down observations. She wrote, "Eleanor Grayson pendant, nervous, likely knows more than she admits. Man in dark coat same as churchyard, limp, silver watch, connection to hoard or society." She tapped her pen against the page, then added, "Visit Mrs. Price tomorrow. Ask about strangers in village." The clock on the mantel chimed 8, and Miss Marple closed the journal, her mind still turning over the day's events. She felt a quiet thrill, the kind that came from unraveling a knotty problem. Eleanor Grayson was a key piece of the puzzle, but she was not the only one. The man in the dark coat, the journal's cryptic warnings, the runes that seemed to pulse with ancient secrets, each was a thread in a tapestry that Miss Marple was determined to weave together. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple glanced out her window, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the garden. The night was still, the village wrapped in a blanket of stars, but she knew better than to trust the calm. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the past was stirring, and Miss Marple was ready to meet it head-on. With a final sip of tea, she turned down the lamp, her mind already planning her next move, a visit to the post office, a chat with Mrs. Price, and perhaps a closer look at the man who thought he could hide in the shadows. The next morning, Miss Marple set out for the post office, her umbrella tucked under her arm despite the clear sky. Mrs. Price, a stout woman with a penchant for gossip, was behind the counter, sorting letters with practiced efficiency. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "What brings you here so early? Not another mystery, I hope." "Oh, nothing so dramatic," Miss Marple said with a smile. "Just posting a letter to my nephew, Raymond. Though I did wonder if you'd noticed any strangers about lately. I saw a man near Eleanor Grayson's shop yesterday, dark coat, bit of a limp, looked out of place. Somehow. Double quotes. Mrs. Price's eyebrows shot up, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A limp, you say? Well, now, that's interesting. Tommy Pierce mentioned a fellow like that hanging about the pub last week. Said he was asking questions about the old manor, of all places. Didn't give a name, but Tommy thought he looked shifty, had a silver watch, to caught the light when he paid for his pint." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained placid. "Did he? Now? How curious. I suppose he's just passing through. But one does wonder what brings a stranger to St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Price nodded sagely. "Mark my words, Miss Marple. There's something afoot. You've a nose for these things. If anyone can get to the bottom of it, it's you." Miss Marple thanked her and left the post office, her mind racing. The man with the limp was no casual visitor. He was connected to the manor, the journal, and perhaps the hoard itself, and Eleanor Grayson, with her rune-engraved pendant and evasive answers, was at the heart of it. As Miss Marple walked home, The village seemed to hum with secrets, each one waiting for her to unravel it. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing she was one step closer to the truth, and a spark of anticipation for what lay ahead. Chapter 5. A dangerous encounter. Late afternoon sun cast long, dappled shadows across the cobblestone lanes of St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of gold and amber. Miss Jane Marple, clad in her sensible tweed coat and clutching her ever-present knitting bag, stepped out of Eleanor Grayson's cluttered antiques shop with a mind buzzing like a hive of bees. The rune-engraved pendant she'd glimpsed on Eleanor's neck, identical to the one described in the vicar's journal, had set her thoughts racing. Eleanor's nervous fidgeting during their tea, her evasive answers about the Viking horde, and the flicker of fear in her eyes when pressed about her family history, all confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Eleanor was entangled in this mystery, perhaps far deeper than she let on. As Miss Marple turned down a quiet lane leading toward her cottage, her sharp eyes caught a movement in her peripheral vision, a man lingering near a gnarled oak tree, half hidden by its sprawling branches. His silhouette was unmistakable, the same broad-shouldered figure she'd sensed watching her in the churchyard 2 nights ago. He wore a dark overcoat, its collar turned up, and a flat cap pulled low over his brow. But his posture betrayed a predatory alertness. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of a puzzle piece slotting into place. She adjusted her grip on her knitting bag, her fingers brushing the reassuring weight of the journal tucked inside, and continued walking at a steady pace, her expression one of serene unawareness. The lane wound past a row of ivy-covered cottages, their windows glowing warmly in the fading light. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from the idyllic scene. The man's presence confirmed her growing theory that the journal, and whatever secrets it held about the Viking horde, was coveted by others. But who was he? A hired thug? A member of the secret society hinted at in the vicar's writings? Or perhaps a descendant of the traitor mentioned in the journal, driven by greed or vengeance? The possibilities danced in her mind, each one a thread to be unraveled. She turned a corner, the lane narrowing as it dipped toward a stone bridge spanning a babbling brook. The man followed, his footsteps deliberate but muffled on the damp earth. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. She had no intention of letting him dictate the terms of this encounter. Her years of observing human nature had taught her that boldness, tempered with cunning, could turn the tables on even the most menacing adversary. Ahead, the bridge offered a strategic opportunity, its low parapet and the dense willows overhanging. The brook provided cover, and the lane beyond branched into 2 paths, one leading to the village square, bustling even at this hour, and the other toward a secluded meadow rarely frequented after dusk. Miss Marple quickened her step, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the cobblestones, and crossed the bridge. She paused at its center, as if admiring the play of light on the water below. But her senses were attuned to the man's approach. He was closer now, perhaps 20 paces behind, his shadow stretching long and lean across the bridge dot in a swift, practiced motion. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and withdrew a small, polished hand mirror, one of her many unassuming tools for sleuthing. Angling it discreetly, she caught a glimpse of her pursuer. His face was partially obscured by the cap, but she noted a strong jaw, a scar slicing through his left eyebrow, and eyes that glinted with a mix of determination and unease. He was no amateur, but neither was he entirely at ease with his task. Interesting, she thought. A man caught between duty and doubt. Miss Marple tucked the mirror away and resumed walking, choosing the path toward the meadow. It was a calculated risk, but she trusted her ability to outwit him in a quieter setting, where her keen senses and quick thinking would have the advantage. The meadow lay beyond a copse of birch trees, its grasses swaying gently in the evening breeze. As she entered the copse, the man's footsteps grew bolder, no longer attempting stealth. He was closing the distance, perhaps sensing an opportunity to confront her in isolation. She reached the meadow's edge and paused, turning slightly as if to catch her breath. The man emerged from the trees, his overcoat flapping as he strode. Toward her, up close, he was taller than she'd estimated, with a build that suggested physical labor rather than refinement. His scar gleamed faintly in the twilight, and his eyes narrowed as he assessed her a frail, elderly woman, seemingly defenseless. Miss Marple suppressed a chuckle. How often had her adversaries underestimated her? Hand over the journal. Old lady, he growled, his voice low and rough, tinged with a faint accent she couldn't quite place, perhaps northern, with a hint of the docks. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild surprise, as if he'd asked her for a recipe rather than a priceless artifact. My goodness, she said, her voice soft but carrying a steely edge. You must be terribly mistaken. I'm just a spinster out for an evening stroll. What journal could you possibly mean? Don't play coy, he snapped, taking a step closer. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Miss Marple's pulse spiked as she anticipated a weapon. But his hand emerged empty, clenched into a fist. I saw you at Grayson's shop. I know you've got it. Give it to me. Or, what, young man? Miss Marple interrupted, her tone sharpening like a blade. She clutched her knitting bag to her chest, her fingers subtly probing for the heavy brass knitting needles within. You'll frighten a poor old woman into a faint, I assure you. My heart is far sturdier than it looks. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Miss Marple seized the opportunity, her mind racing through her options. She could scream, but the meadow was too far from the village for anyone to hear. She could run, but he'd overtake her in seconds. No, her best weapon was her wit and a touch of theatrics. Suddenly, she gasped, her free hand fluttering to her chest. Oh, dear, she murmured, swaying slightly. My heart. It's acting up again. Please, I need my medicine. Her voice trembled, and she staggered back, leaning against a birch tree for support. Her eyes, however, remained sharp, watching his reaction. The man hesitated, his aggression faltering. Don't try that on me, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. He took a cautious step forward, his hands hovering as if unsure whether to grab her or help her. Miss Marple let out a faint moan, her knees buckling just enough to sell the performance. "My pills. In my bag," she whispered, letting the knitting bag slip from her grasp. It fell to the ground with a soft thud, its contents spilling slightly a skein of wool. A pair of spectacles and the corner of the journal peeking. Out tantalizingly, the man's eyes locked onto the journal, and he lunged for the bag. In that split second, Miss Marple straightened, her feigned frailty vanishing. She snatched a knitting needle from the ground and jabbed it firmly but not cruelly into the back of his hand. He yelped, recoiling, and Miss Marple scooped up the bag, darting toward the meadow with surprising agility for a woman of her age. "You little," he snarled, clutching his hand. But Miss Marple was already moving, weaving through the tall grasses. She knew the meadow well from her childhood romps and headed for a narrow path that led to a stile connecting to the village square. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from exhilaration. She'd outsmarted him, but she wasn't out of danger. Yet the man recovered quickly, his heavy footsteps thudding behind her. Miss Marple reached the stiler, low wooden fence and clambered over it with less grace than she'd have liked, her skirt catching briefly on a splinter. She freed herself with a tug and glanced back. He was gaining, his face twisted with fury. She needed a distraction, something to slow him down. Her eyes fell on a nearby hedgerow, thick with brambles and dotted with late summer blackberries. She veered toward it, deliberately slowing her pace to lure him closer. As he reached out to grab her, she ducked low and rolled a maneuver she hadn't attempted since her girlhood, and scrambled into the hedgerow's shadow. Thorns snagged her coat, but she ignored them. Curling into a tight ball, the man crashed into the brambles, cursing as the thorns tore at his coat and hands. "Where are you, you old bat?" he roared, thrashing blindly. Miss Marple held her breath, her body pressed against the damp earth. She could smell the rich, loamy scent of the soil and the faint sweetness of the berries. Her mind, however, was already elsewhere, piecing together his identity. That scar, that accent, that brute strength. He was no scholar or gentleman. A hired man, perhaps, but for whom? Eleanor? Or someone higher in the chain of this mysterious order? The man's thrashing grew frantic, then subsided as he realized she'd vanished. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice laced with venom. He retreated, his footsteps fading toward the meadow. Miss Marple waited several minutes, her ears straining for any sign of his return, before emerging cautiously. Her coat was torn, her hair slightly askew, but her eyes gleamed with triumph. She'd escaped, journal intact, and gained a valuable clue. Her pursuer's face and voice were now etched in her memory. She brushed herself off and made her way to the village square, where the warm glow of the Fox and Hound pub spilled onto the cobblestones. She considered stopping to phone her nephew, Raymond, for assistance, but decided against it. She needed time to think, to decode the journal's secrets, and to plan her next move. The man Thomas Blackwood, she suspected. Recalling a name whispered in Eleanor's shop wouldn't give up easily, but neither would she dot at her cottage. Miss Marple locked the door and drew the curtains before settling at her kitchen table. She spread the journal before her, its leather cover worn but intact. The encounter had sharpened her resolve, and she felt a surge of satisfaction at having outwitted Blackwood. But the journal held more than historical musings. It concealed a message, one she was determined to crack. She lit a lamp, its soft glow illuminating the pages, and began to study the text. The vicar's handwriting was precise, but certain words stood out, written in a slightly darker ink. She jotted them down: forest, stones, vault, rune. A pattern emerged, and after an hour of cross-referencing with her notes from Professor Hargreaves' runic translations, she uncovered a hidden directive: seek the vault where 3 stones stand, marked by the rune of thorn. Miss Marple leaned back, her fingers tapping the table. The forest beyond St. Mary Mead was vast, but she recalled a clearing where 3 ancient stones formed a triangle, rumored to be a Viking marker. The rune of thorn was trickier. Professor Hargreaves had mentioned it as a symbol of protection, often carved to ward off intruders. Could it mark the hoard's location? She closed the journal, her mind alight with possibilities. Blackwood's pursuit confirmed the hoard's value, but his desperation suggested a larger scheme. Was he acting alone, or was he a pawn in the Order's game? And what of Eleanor's role? The pendant, the nervous glances. Miss Marple was certain Eleanor was no innocent bystander. As she prepared for bed, she packed a small rucksack with essentials: a torch, a map of the forest, and her trusty knitting needles. Tomorrow she would venture into the woods, guided by the journal's clue. Blackwood's threat loomed, but Miss Marple felt no fear, only a quiet confidence. She had faced danger before: village scandals, poison pens, even murderers, and emerged victorious through patience and observation. Slipping into bed, she glanced at the journal on her nightstand. The mystery was unfolding, each clue a step closer to the truth. She closed her eyes, a faint smile playing on her lips. Thomas Blackwood might think he had the upper hand, but he had yet to learn the tenacity of Miss Jane Marple. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the sky a vibrant blue that promised a fine day for sleuthing. Miss Marple rose early, her energy belying her age, and donned a sturdy walking outfit: a woolen skirt, a warm cardigan, and her trusty brogues. She breakfasted lightly on tea and toast, her mind replaying the previous evening's encounter. Blackwood's scarred face and rough voice lingered, but so did the journal's cryptic message. The forest vault awaited, and she was determined to find it before he did. She set out after 9, her rucksack slung over one shoulder, and her knitting bag now a decoy, with the journal safely tucked in the rucksack dangling from her arm. The village was stirring, with shopkeepers sweeping their stoops and children scampering to school. Miss Marple exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Bantry, who was pruning her roses, and deflected questions about her plans with a vague mention of a nature walk. Her reputation as a harmless spinster served her well. No one suspected the adventure she was embarking on. The forest lay a mile beyond the village, accessible via a winding footpath that skirted a barley field. As Miss Marple walked, she kept her senses alert, scanning for any sign of Blackwood. The path was deserted, save for a pair of magpies chattering in a hawthorn bush. She recalled the old rhyme: 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, and smiled. Joy, indeed, if she could unravel this mystery. The forest loomed ahead, its canopy a tapestry of green and gold. Miss Marple paused at its edge, consulting her map. The clearing with the 3 stones was deep within, near a stream that fed the brook she'd crossed the previous night. She marked the route with a pencil, then plunged into the forest. The air cool and fragrant with pine and moss. The path narrowed, roots and bracken snagging her skirt. But Miss Marple pressed on, her torch at the ready for darker stretches. Birdsong filled the air, but she remained vigilant, her ears attuned to any unnatural sound. After 30 minutes, she reached the clearing, a small, sunlit glade where 3 moss-covered stones stood like silent sentinels. Each was roughly hewn, their surfaces etched with faint, weathered carvings. Miss Marple approached the stones, her heart quickening. She traced the carvings with a gloved finger, searching for the rune of thorn, a jagged symbol resembling a lightning bolt. The first stone yielded nothing but spirals, the second a series of knots. On the third, near its base, she found it, a deep, deliberate carving, its edges sharp despite centuries of wind and rain. She stepped back, surveying the clearing. The journal's clue suggested a vault, but the ground appeared undisturbed. Blanketed with grass and clover, she knelt, probing the soil with a knitting needle, and detected a faint hollow sound near the 3rd stone. Digging carefully with her hands, she uncovered a flat stone slab, its edges sealed with clay. A vault, indeed. Before she could investigate further, a twig snapped behind her. Miss Marple froze, her hand slipping to her torch. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the trees. A figure emerged blackwood, his scar livid in the dappled light. A length of rope coiled in his hands. "Found it, have you?" he said, his voice a low growl. "You're more trouble than you're worth, old woman." Miss Marple rose, brushing dirt from her skirt with deliberate calm. "And you, Mr. Blackwood, are far too predictable," she replied, her tone crisp. "Following me again? You really must find a new hobby." His eyes widened at the mention of his name, but he recovered, quickly stepping closer. "Hand over the journal, and I might let you walk away." Miss Marple's mind raced. The vault was within reach, but Blackwood's rope suggested he meant to restrain her, or worse. She needed to stall, to turn his aggression against him. Her eyes flicked to the slab, then back to him. "Very well," she said, feigning resignation. "The journal's in my rucksack. But tell me, Mr. Blackwood, who sent you? Eleanor Grayson, or someone else pulling the strings?" He snorted, but his grip on the rope tightened. "You think you're clever, don't you? No one sent me. I'm in this for myself, a lone wolf." Then Miss Marple said, arching an eyebrow, "I doubt that. A man like you doesn't decipher ancient runes or chase Viking hordes without guidance. Who's your master, I wonder?" His face flushed, and he lunged, the rope snapping taut. Miss Marple sidestepped, lighter on her feet than he expected, and swung her torch, catching him on the wrist. He grunted, dropping the rope, and she darted toward the trees, her rucksack bouncing against her back. The chase was on, Blackwood's curses echoing through the forest. Miss Marple wove through the undergrowth, her knowledge of the terrain giving her an edge. She reached the stream, its banks slippery with moss, and crossed it using a fallen log. Blackwood followed, but his heavier frame slowed him, and he slipped. Splashing into the shallow water, Miss Marple pressed her advantage. Climbing a low ridge that overlooked the clearing, she crouched behind a boulder, her breath steady despite the exertion. Blackwood emerged from the stream, soaked and furious, but he didn't pursue her further. Instead, he returned to the clearing, kneeling beside the slab. He began to pry it open, his movements frantic. Miss Marple watched, torn between intervening and retreating. The vault's contents were her goal, but Blackwood's strength outmatched hers. She needed reinforcements, perhaps Raymond, or even the local constable. She crept back, memorizing the route, and made her way to the forest's edge. At the village, she phoned Raymond from the post office, her voice calm but urgent. "I've found something extraordinary, dear," she said, "but I'll need your help tomorrow. Bring sturdy boots and perhaps a cricket bat." As she hung up, Miss Marple felt a surge of triumph. Blackwood might have the slab open by now, but she had the journal, the rune's meaning, and a plan. The hoard was close, but so was the truth about the order, and she was determined to uncover both. Chapter 6. The forest volve morning mist clung to the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, weaving through the ancient oaks and elms that fringed the village like silent sentinels. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible shoes damp from the dew, stood at the edge of the forest, her breath visible in the crisp air. In her gloved hand, she clutched the journal she had found in the manor, its leather cover worn but intact, its pages whispering secrets of a Viking horde. The cryptic clues within had led her here, to a place where the trees grew dense and the light barely pierced the canopy. She adjusted her hat, a simple tweed affair, and felt a familiar flutter of anticipation. The puzzle was unfolding, and she was determined to see it through. The journal's final decoded message had been clear. Beneath the stones where 3 rivers meet, the vault awaits. Miss Marple had spent the previous evening poring over local maps with Professor Hargreaves, her old friend whose expertise in ancient history was matched only by his enthusiasm for a good mystery. They had identified a spot deep in blackthorn wood where 3 small streams converged, their waters murmuring over mossy rocks. The professor had warned her of the forest's reputation, tales of lost travelers, eerie lights, and whispers of a curse tied to the Viking horde. Miss Marple had smiled politely, her mind already racing ahead to the practicalities of her expedition. Now, standing at the forest's edge, she surveyed the path ahead. It was little more than a deer trail, winding through brambles and under low-hanging branches. Her basket, usually reserved for knitting or scones, now held a flashlight, a small trowel, a notebook, and a thermos of tea essentials for a morning's sleuthing. She tightened her scarf and stepped forward, her steps deliberate but light, as if she were merely strolling to the village shop. The forest swallowed her petite figure, and the sounds of St. Mary Mead faded behind her. The trail was treacherous, slick with mud and littered with roots that seemed to reach for her ankles. Miss Marple moved with care, her sharp eyes scanning for signs of the rune-carved stones mentioned in the journal. She had memorized the sketch from the vellum map, its jagged lines depicting a circle of stones at the confluence of the streams. As she walked, the forest seemed to watch her, its silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a rook. She felt no fear, only the quiet thrill of being on the cusp of discovery. After nearly an hour, the sound of water grew louder, and the trees parted to reveal a small clearing where the three streams met. Their waters braided together, sparkling in the weak sunlight that filtered through the branches. In the center of the clearing stood a ring of stones, each about the height of a child, their surfaces weathered but unmistakably etched with runes. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She approached the nearest stone, her fingers tracing the angular symbols. They matched the Norse runes Professor Hargreaves had shown her. Fehu, Euros, Ansu, symbols of wealth, strength, and wisdom. The journal had described a vault hidden beneath these stones, and she was determined to find it. Kneeling beside the largest stone, she examined the ground. The earth was soft, disturbed, as if someone had been here recently. Her trowel well bit into the soil, and within minutes she uncovered a flat, slate-like slab. It was heavy, but with a bit of leverage from a nearby branch, she pried it loose. Beneath it lay a dark, rectangular opening, a trapdoor of sorts, its edges lined with moss. Miss Marple's lips curved into a satisfied smile. She shone her flashlight into the hole, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and musty, carrying the scent of earth and age. She hesitated only a moment. The journal had warned of dangerous traps, perhaps, or guardians of the hoard, but Miss Marple trusted her instincts. She tucked her skirt into her belt, an unladylike but practical move, and began her descent. The stairs were uneven, slick, with damp, and she moved slowly, one hand on the rough wall for balance. The beam of her flashlight danced across the stone, illuminating faint carvings, more runes, spiraling downward like a story etched in the earth. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a small chamber. The walls were hewn from bedrock, their surfaces glistening with moisture. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and on it, a collection of artifacts that made Miss Marple's breath catch. There were gold coins, their surfaces tarnished but gleaming faintly, stamped with unfamiliar symbols. Beside them lay a dagger, its hilt encrusted with jewels that winked in the flashlight's beam. A few scattered trinkets, rings, a brooch, a small bronze figurine of a warrior completed the collection. But this was no hoard. Not in the grand sense the journal had implied. The true treasure, she suspected, lay deeper. She approached the pedestal, her eyes scanning for clues. The journal had mentioned a deeper vault, accessible only to those who understood the runes. She examined the dagger, its blade etched with a single word, Opna, Norse for open. Professor Hargreaves had told her. She turned her attention to the pedestal, noticing a faint seam running along its base. Kneeling again, she pressed her fingers against it, feeling for a mechanism. A soft click rewarded her efforts, and a section of the pedestal slid aside, revealing another trapdoor, this one smaller and lined with iron. Before she could investigate further, a sound froze her in place. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing from the staircase above. Her heart raced, but her mind remained calm. She switched off her flashlight and pressed herself against the wall, her small frame blending into the shadows. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by voices. Two men, their tones low and urgent. "We're wasting time, Blackwood," one said, his voice rough with frustration. "The old bat's been sniffing around. If she finds the vault before us, she won't," came the reply, sharp and commanding. Miss Marple recognized the voice instantly. Thomas Blackwood, the man who had confronted her in the lane. "Eleanor says the ritual's set for tomorrow night. We just need to secure the dagger and the tablets. The rest is hers to deal with." Miss Marple's mind raced. Eleanor Grayson, the antiques dealer, was involved, perhaps even leading this scheme. The ritual they mentioned confirmed her suspicions of a secret society. The Order of the Rune, as Professor Hargreaves had suggested. But what was their plan, and why the dagger? The men entered the chamber, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Miss Marple held her breath, her body pressed against the cold stone. She could see them now. Blackwood, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a cap, and another man, smaller, with a nervous twitch in his movements. They approached the pedestal, and the smaller man cursed. "It's been disturbed," he said, his voice rising. "Someone's been here." "Calm yourself, Ridley," Blackwood snapped. "It's probably just animals. The vault's still sealed." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the open seam at the pedestal's base. She had been careful, but not careful enough. "If they noticed, look," Ridley said, pointing to the ground. "Fresh dirt. Someone's dug here." Blackwood knelt, his flashlight illuminating the displaced soil. His face hardened. "Marple," he growled. "That meddling old woman." Miss Marple's lips tightened. She was no stranger to being underestimated, but it still stung. She weighed her options. The chamber was small, with no other exits. The trapdoor in the pedestal was her only hope, but opening it now would reveal her presence. She needed a distraction. Moving silently, she reached into her basket and pulled out a single gold coin she had pocketed from the pedestal. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it toward the far corner of the chamber. It clinked against the stone, and both men spun toward the sound. "What was that?" Ridley whispered, his flashlight darting wildly. "Stay here," Blackwood ordered, striding toward the noise. Miss Marple seized her chance. She slipped to the pedestal, her fingers finding the iron trapdoor. It was heavy, but desperation lent her strength. She lifted it just enough to slide through, pulling it shut behind her. The mechanism clicked softly, sealing her in darkness. She heard Blackwood's curse from above, followed by the sound of boots on stone, but the trapdoor held. She switched on her flashlight, revealing a narrow tunnel sloping downward. The air was colder here, the walls closer, but she pressed forward, her curiosity outweighing her fear. The tunnel twisted and turned, its walls etched with more runes warnings, perhaps, or directions. After what felt like an eternity, it opened into a second chamber, larger than the first. Here, at last, was the true vault, The room was circular, its walls lined with stone shelves. On them rested dozens of artifacts, small coins, goblets, a shield embossed with a dragon, and tablets inscribed with runes. In the center stood a stone altar, its surface carved with a map that mirrored the one on the vellum. Miss Marple approached, her eyes wide with wonder. This was the Viking hoard, or at least a significant part of it. But the tablets intrigued her most. She lifted one, its weight surprising her, and studied the inscriptions. They were unlike the others, more intricate, almost narrative. If only she had time to translate them. A faint scraping sound from the tunnel snapped her back to reality. Blackwood and Ridley were coming. She scanned the chamber for an escape, but found none. The altar caught her eye again, its base hollowed out slightly. She crouched, peering inside, and saw a small lever. With a quick prayer, she pulled it. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow passage. She slipped through just as the men's voices echoed into the chamber. "She's here somewhere," Blackwood said, his tone laced with fury. "Find her." Miss Marple hurried through the passage, her flashlight bobbing. It led upward, emerging behind a thicket of brambles some distance from the clearing. She pushed through, ignoring the scratches on her hands, and found herself back in the forest, the strings gurgling nearby. She tucked the single coin she had kept into her pocket, along with a mental note of the tablet's inscriptions. The dagger, unfortunately, remained on the pedestal above, but she had seen enough to confirm her suspicions as she made her way back to the village. The forest seemed less menacing, its secrets partially unveiled. Miss Marple's mind buzzed with questions. What was the ritual Blackwood mentioned? Why was Eleanor Grayson, with her rune-engraved pendant, so deeply involved? And what power did the Order of the Rune believe the hoard held? She felt a quiet satisfaction in her discoveries: the coin, the tablets, the hidden vault, but the puzzle was far from complete. Back at her cottage, she brewed a pot of tea and sat by the fire, the journal open before her. The coin rested on the table, its surface catching the firelight. She jotted down the runes she had memorized, determined to consult Professor Hargreaves again. The Order's plans were accelerating, and she needed to act quickly. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of triumph. She had outwitted Blackwood and Ridley, found the vault, and escaped with evidence. The game, as Sherlock Holmes might have said, was afoot. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes bright with resolve. Tomorrow, she would attend the village fete, where she suspected Eleanor and Blackwood would reveal more of their scheme. For now, she was content to plan her next move, her mind as sharp as the jeweled dagger she had left behind. The forest vault had yielded its secrets, but the greater mystery, the true purpose of the hoard, still awaited her. Chapter 7. The Society's returned late afternoon sun cast long shadows over St. Mary Mead, painting the cobblestone paths in hues of gold and amber. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The journal, its leather cover worn and cracked, lay open on the table beside her, its pages whispering secrets of a forgotten age. Professor Hargreaves' visit that morning had confirmed her suspicions. The Order of the Rune, a secret society once thought extinct, was very much alive. Its tendrils coiled around the village like ivy on an ancient oak. The revelation had set her mind alight. Each clue a spark in the intricate puzzle she was determined to solve. The village fate was in full swing by the time Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the path. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked scones, the laughter of children, and the hum of gossip. The fete, held annually on the village green, was a kaleidoscope of color-bright bunting fluttered between trees, stalls brimmed with homemade jams and whereupon scarves, and a brass band played a jaunty tune. To the untrained eye, it was a scene of idyllic charm. But Miss Marple's sharp gaze saw more. The flicker of a glance, the tightening of a jaw, the subtle shift of a body turning away. These were the threads of human nature, and she was a master at weaving them into truth. Her straw had tilted slightly against the sun. She moved through the crowd with the grace of a sparrow, unassuming yet purposeful. She carried a small basket, ostensibly for purchases, but it was her excuse to linger, to listen, to observe. The journal had hinted at the Order's influence in local affairs, and the fate, with its convergence of villagers, was the perfect stage for their machinations. She had a hunch that Eleanor Grayson and Thomas Blackwood would be here, and where they were. The Order shadow would follow Dot at the jam store. Miss Marple paused, inspecting a jar of raspberry preserve with feigned interest. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, bustled over, her cheeks flushed from the heat. Miss Marple, "Do try my gooseberry jam this year. It's won first prize," she exclaimed, thrusting a jar into Miss Marple's hands. "Oh, how lovely, Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm, but her eyes scanning the crowd over the rim of her spectacles. "You've outdone yourself. Tell me, have you seen Eleanor Grayson about? I thought I might have a word about her antiques." Mrs. Clement's smile faltered, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her apron. "Eleanor, oh, she's here somewhere, I expect. Keeps to herself, that one. I saw her near the tea tent earlier, talking to that rough-looking man Blackwood. Isn't odd pair, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind cataloguing the detail. "Odd, indeed. Well, I mustn't keep you. This jam will be a treat with my scones." She slipped the jar into her basket and moved on, her steps deliberate. The tea tent was her next destination, a hub of chatter where secrets often spilled over cups of Earl Grey. The tent was a hive of activity, its canvas walls billowing in the breeze. Villagers clustered around tables, their voices a symphony of small talk and laughter. Miss Marple spotted Eleanor Grayson at once, her tall, angular frame unmistakable despite the crowd. She wore a high-necked blouse and a severe bun, her rune engraved, pendant glinting at her throat. Beside her stood Thomas Blackwood, his broad shoulders hunched as he leaned in to speak, his face shadowed by a low-brimmed hat. Their conversation was intense, their gestures sharp, and Miss Marple's curiosity sharpened like a blade. She approached a nearby table, where Mrs. Bantry, a friend of many years, was holding court with a group of younger women. Jane, Mrs. Bantry called, waving her over. "Come, rescue me from these dreadful stories about the price of butter. Have a cuppa." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair with a clear view of Eleanor and Blackwood. "I'd love one, Dolly, though I must say the fete seems livelier than usual this year." Mrs. Bantry snorted, pouring tea from a chipped pot. "Lively? It's positively buzzing with gossip. Did you hear about the vicar's new curate? Caught sneaking into the church at midnight, or so they say. And then there's Eleanor Grayson, acting like she owns the place. I swear she's been glaring at everyone since she arrived." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes flicking to Eleanor, who was now gesturing animatedly at Blackwood. "Has she, now? I suppose she's under some strain. With her shop and all. I heard she's come into some rare artifacts recently." Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed with interest. "Artifacts? Oh, do tell. You know I love a good mystery. Is it that Viking nonsense again? People have been whispering about it since that letter arrived at your door." Miss Marple's lips twitched, but she kept her tone light. "Oh, just village talk, I'm sure. Though I did hear Eleanor mention something about a ritual, some old tradition tied to the church. Perhaps." Mrs. Bantry's brows shot up. "A ritual? Sounds positively pagan. You don't think she's mixed up in something sinister, do you?" Miss Marple chuckled, patting her friend's hand. "Now, Dolly, you know how stories grow in a village. I'm sure it's nothing of the sort." But her mind was elsewhere, fixed on the heated exchange across the tent. Eleanor's voice, though low, carried a sharp edge, and Blackwood's scowl deepened with every word. Miss Marple strained to catch their conversation, her knack for eavesdropping honed by years of quiet observation. She excused herself from Mrs. Bantry's table, murmuring something about needing more scones, and drifted closer to the pair. She paused by a display of embroidered cushions, pretending to admire the stitching while her ears caught fragments of their words. "Can't afford another mistake, Thomas," Eleanor hissed, her voice taut. "The ritual must happen tonight. The Horde's power. Keep your voice down," Blackwood growled, his hand gripping her arm. "If that old bat gets wind of this, we're done for." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained a mask of placid interest in the cushions. She recognized Blackwood's reference to herself, and it only fueled her determination. The mention of a ritual confirmed Professor Hargreaves' warning. The Order of the Rune was planning something, and the fate was their cover. She needed to know more where, when, and why. She moved to the edge of the tent, where a low hedge offered a discreet vantage point. From there, she could see Eleanor and Blackwood slip away from the crowd, heading toward the old oak at the far end of the green. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her steps muffled by the grass, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The oak, gnarled and ancient, stood like a sentinel, its branches heavy with secrets. She crouched behind a cluster of rose bushes, her knees protesting, but her resolve unwavering. Eleanor and Blackwood stood close, their voices barely audible over the distant band music. Miss Marple leaned forward, catching snatches of their plan: the stone circle, Eleanor said, her tone commanding. "Midnight. The dagger must be used precisely as the journal instructs. If we awaken the Horde's power, no one will stand in our way." Blackwood's voice was gruff, tinged with doubt. "And if it doesn't work? We've risked everything for this, Eleanor." "The Order's impatient. It will work," she snapped. "The runes don't lie. The chieftain's blessing is ours to claim." Miss Marple's mind raced. The stone circle, an ancient ring of weathered stones in the hills beyond the village, was a place of local legend, said to hum with strange energy on moonlit nights. The journal had mentioned a sacred site, and this must be it. The jeweled dagger, which she'd glimpsed in the forest vault, was clearly central to their plan. But what was this power they sought? A curse, as the village rumors suggested, or something more tangible? Control, wealth, influence? She retreated silently, her heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. The fate continued around her, oblivious to the undercurrent of intrigue. She needed a plan to infiltrate the ritual, but first she had to ensure her own safety. Blackwood's threat in the lane had been no idle warning, and Eleanor's authority within the Order made her even more dangerous. Miss Marple returned to the tea tent, her mind already mapping out the evening. Back at her cottage, she spread the journal across her dining table, its pages illuminated by the soft glow of a lamp. She traced the runes with a finger, recalling Professor Hargreaves' translations. The Order believed the Horde held a mystical power, tied to a Viking chieftain's blessing. But Miss Marple, ever practical, suspected a more prosaic motive: greed, perhaps, or a desire for control over the village's history. The ritual was their endgame, and she intended to be there to unravel it. She telephoned her nephew, Raymond West, who was visiting from London. "Raymond, dear," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I need your help tonight. Bring a torch and wear dark clothing. And do be punctual, it's rather important." Raymond, accustomed to his aunt's cryptic requests, arrived at dusk. His writer's curiosity piqued over tea. Miss Marple outlined her plan. They would approach the stone circle under cover of darkness, staying hidden until the ritual began. She needed evidence photographs, perhaps, or a recording of the ceremony to expose the Order. Raymond, though skeptical of the danger, agreed, his admiration for his aunt's tenacity outweighing his doubts. As night fell, Miss Marple donned a dark shawl and sturdy boots, tucking the journal into her basket for reference. Raymond carried a small camera, its flash disabled to avoid detection. They set out, the village quiet save for the distant hoot of an owl. The path to the stone circle wound through fields and up a gentle hill, the air cool and heavy with the scent of earth. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. At the crest of the hill, the stone circle loomed, its monolith stark against the sky. Miss Marple and Raymond crouched behind a boulder, their breaths shallow. Figures were already gathering, cloaked shapes moving with purpose, their voices a low murmur. Eleanor's silhouette was unmistakable, the rune pendant glinting as she lit a torch. Blackwood stood beside her, his bulk imposing, while others, perhaps a dozen, formed a loose ring around a central stone altar. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she counted the figures. Some she recognized: Mr. Harrow, the butcher, whose sudden wealth had puzzled her, Mrs. Lyle, the postmistress, whose nervous demeanour had always seemed out of place. The order had woven itself into the fabric of St. Mary Mead, its members hidden in plain sight. She whispered to Raymond, "Take photographs when you can, but stay low. We mustn't be seen." The ritual began with a chant, the words guttural and unfamiliar, echoing the runes in the journal. Eleanor raised the jeweled dagger, its blade catching the torchlight. She spoke, her voice resonant with authority. "By the power of the chieftains, blood, we claim the Horde's blessing. Let the runes awaken, let the circle bind us." Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the scene. The blessing was likely a myth, a story to justify the Order's control over the Horde's wealth. But the dagger's role intrigued her. Its craftsmanship suggested more than decoration. Was it a key, a relic, or something else entirely? She leaned closer, her fingers gripping the journal, as Eleanor placed the dagger on the altar. Tracing runes in the air. Suddenly, a twig snapped under Raymond's foot. The chant faltered, and Blackwood's head whipped toward their hiding place. Miss Marple's heart sank, but she acted swiftly, pulling Raymond down and whispering, "Stay still." The moment passed, the ritual resuming, but her pulse didn't slow. They were too close to discovery. As the ceremony reached its peak, Eleanor lifted a small chest, likely the one from the forest vault, and opened it, revealing a handful of gold coins. The crowd gasped, their eyes gleaming with greed. Miss Marple saw her chance. She nudged Raymond, who snapped a series of photographs, the camera shutter silent but precise. The evidence was hers, but she needed more: the dagger, perhaps, or a clearer understanding of the ritual's purpose. The night grew colder, the chant louder, and Miss Marple's resolve hardened. She whispered a new plan to Raymond. They would wait until the ritual ended, then follow Eleanor to see where she took the chest, if the Horde's true location was still hidden. Eleanor's actions would reveal it. As the ceremony closed, the figures dispersed, their cloaks blending into the darkness. Eleanor and Blackwood lingered, speaking in low tones, the chest tucked under Eleanor's arm. Miss Marple and Raymond trailed them at a distance, moving silently through the fields. Eleanor led Blackwood to a small barn on the village outskirts, its doors creaking as they entered. Miss Marple peered through a cracked window, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Inside, Eleanor placed the chest on a table, her fingers tracing its runes. Blackwood paced, his voice tense. "This better work, Eleanor. The Order's losing patience, and I'm not taking the fall." "It will," Eleanor replied, her voice cold. "The Horde is ours. The ritual binds it to us. Tomorrow, we move it to the well." Miss Marple's breath caught. The well, the journal's final clue, which she hadn't yet deciphered. Her satisfaction was tempered by caution. She needed to act before the Order could relocate the Horde. She signaled Raymond to retreat, and they slipped back to the village, her mind already planning her next move. At her cottage, Miss Marple pored over the journal, her fingers tracing the final runes. The well, she realized, was not just a hiding place but a symbolic one, tied to the Viking chieftain's blessing. She felt a surge of triumph. She was one step ahead of the Order, tomorrow. She would confront the well's secret, but tonight she had evidence, photographs, and a clearer picture of the Order's scheme. As she sipped her tea, the familiar comfort of her cottage grounding her, she smiled. The game was far from over, but Miss Marple was in her element, unraveling the threads of greed and mystery with every careful step. Chapter 8. The midnight ritual moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, its pale light filtering through the gnarled branches of ancient oaks, casting eerie shadows on the path to the stone circle. Miss Jane Marple, her heart steady despite the chill, in the air, adjusted the borrowed cloak that draped her slight frame. The garment, a heavy woolen affair pilfered from her neighbor Mrs. Clement's attic, smelled faintly of mothballs and lavender, but it served its purpose, concealing her identity as she ventured into the night's clandestine affair. Her sensible shoes crunched softly on the gravel path, each step measured, her mind sharp and alert, weaving together the threads of the mystery that had consumed her for weeks. The stone circle, a relic of forgotten times, lay just beyond the village, hidden in a clearing where the forest thickened. Local legend whispered of its ancient power, of rituals performed under starlit skies. But Miss Marple dismissed such tales as fanciful exaggerations until tonight. The Order of the Rune, as Professor Hargreaves had revealed, was no mere historical footnote. It was alive, its members scheming in the shadows, and their plans centered on the Viking horde she'd been chasing. Tonight, she would infiltrate their ritual, armed with nothing but her wits and a small torch tucked into her handbag. As she approached the clearing, the air grew heavy, charged with an unnatural stillness. The stone circle loomed ahead, its monolithic slabs arranged in a near-perfect ring, their surfaces weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Faint voices drifted on the breeze, low and rhythmic, like a chant. Miss Marple crouched behind a thicket, her eyes adjusting to the dim glow of torches flickering within the circle. Figures moved in the firelight, their silhouettes draped in cloaks similar to hers, their faces obscured by hoods. She counted 7, their movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. At the center stood Eleanor Grayson, the antiques dealer, her presence commanding despite her slight stature. In her hand gleamed the jeweled dagger Miss Marple had glimpsed in the forest vault, its blade catching the torchlight with a menacing shimmer. Miss Marple's breath caught as she recognized the dagger's significance. The journal had described it as the key to awakening the Horde's power, a phrase she'd initially dismissed as superstitious nonsense. Yet here it was, wielded by Eleanor, who now raised it skyward, her voice rising in a strange, guttural chant. The words were unfamiliar, a blend of Old Norse and something older, their cadence hypnotic. The other figures joined in, their voices weaving a haunting melody that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself. She edged closer, careful to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. Her vantage point offered a clear view of the circle's center, where a low stone altar stood, its surface etched with runes that matched those on the anonymous letters she'd received weeks ago. On the altar lay a small, intricately carved box, its lid adorned with a single ruby that glowed like a coal in the torchlight. Miss Marple's mind raced. Was this the Horde itself, or merely a vessel for its supposed power? The journal had hinted at a ritual, a blood oath tied to the Viking treasure. But the details remained maddeningly vague. She needed to get closer, to see the box's contents, but the risk of discovery loomed large. The chant grew louder, more insistent, and Eleanor's voice cut through the night like a blade. By the blood of the ancients, by the will of the runes, we summon the power that sleeps, she intoned, her eyes blazing with fervor. The other figures swayed, their hoods concealing their identities. But Miss Marple's sharp gaze caught a familiar silhouette among them: Thomas Blackwood, the man who'd confronted her in the lane. His presence confirmed her suspicions. He was no mere thug but a key player in this shadowy game. As Eleanor lowered the dagger toward the altar, Miss Marple's instincts screamed for action. She couldn't let the ritual proceed, not without understanding its purpose. Her eyes scanned the clearing, landing on a torch propped against one of the stones. Its flame flickering precariously, an idea sparked. If she could disrupt the ceremony, create a moment of chaos, she might slip away with the dagger or at least glimpse the box's contents. Her hand closed around the small torch in her handbag, its weight reassuring. She'd always prided herself on her resourcefulness, and tonight would be no exception. The chant reached a crescendo, and Eleanor's dagger hovered inches above the ruby-studded box. Miss Marple took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. She crept forward, staying low, until she was within arm's reach of the propped torch. With a swift, practiced motion, she nudged it with her foot, sending it toppling into a pile of dry leaves at the circle's edge. The leaves caught fire instantly, flames licking upward with a crackle that shattered the ritual's rhythm. The chanters faltered, their voices breaking as heads turned toward the sudden blaze. "Who's there?" Eleanor snapped, her voice sharp with suspicion. She clutched the dagger tightly, her eyes scanning the shadows. The other figures froze, their hoods swiveling as they searched for the intruder. Miss Marple pressed herself against a stone, her heart pounding but her mind clear. The fire was spreading, small but distracting, and the group's attention was divided. Now was her chance. She slipped around the stone's edge, moving silently toward the altar. The box was within reach, its ruby glinting like a beacon. But as she reached for it, a hand clumped onto her arm, yanking her back. She spun to face Thomas Blackwood, his face twisted with rage beneath his hood. "You again," he hissed, his grip tightening. "You don't know what you're meddling with, old woman." Miss Marple's mind raced, but her voice remained calm, almost conversational. "Oh, I think I do. Mr. Blackwood, a Viking horde, a secret society, and a rather theatrical ritual. But tell me, what's in that box? Gold, power, or just another piece of your little game?" His eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a shout from the circle drew his attention. The fire had spread to a nearby bush, and two of the cloaked figures were scrambling to douse it with their cloaks. Eleanor's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Find the intruder. The ritual must not be stopped." Blackwood's grip slackened for a moment, and Miss Marple seized her chance. With a deft twist, she slipped free, her small stature belying her agility. She darted toward the altar, her fingers brushing the box's lid before Blackwood lunged after her. In a split-second decision, she grabbed the jeweled dagger from Eleanor's hand. Knocking it free as she stumbled backward, the dagger skittered across the ground, landing near the burning leaves. Chaos erupted. Eleanor screamed, a sound of pure fury, as she dove for the dagger. The other figures surged forward, their hoods falling back to reveal faces Miss Marple recognized a local butcher, a retired schoolteacher, even the postmaster's wife. The Order of the Rune was no distant cabal, but a web woven into the fabric of St. Mary Mead itself. The realization hit her like a cold wave, but there was no time to dwell on it. She bolted for the trees, the dagger clutched tightly in her hand. The fire was spreading faster now, its smoke curling into the night sky, obscuring her escape. Shouts echoed behind her, but she didn't look back. Her legs, though not as spry as they once were, carried her swiftly through the underbrush, guided by the moonlight and her own unerring sense of direction. She knew these woods well, having walked them countless times in her youth, and she used every shortcut, every hidden path, to put distance between herself and the circle. As she ran, her mind pieced together the night's revelations. The box, the dagger, the chant, they were all part of a ritual tied to the Viking horde. But its purpose remained unclear. Was it truly about power, as Eleanor had claimed? Or was there something more mundane at play? Greed, perhaps, dressed up in mystical trappings? The dagger in her hand felt heavy, its hilt intricately carved with runes that matched those on the altar. It was a clue, a tangible piece of the puzzle, and she felt a surge of satisfaction at having secured it. She reached a small stream, its waters glinting under the moon, and paused to catch her breath. The sounds of pursuit had faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. She tucked the dagger into her handbag, wrapping it carefully in a handkerchief to avoid smudging any potential evidence. Her heart still raced, but her mind was calm, already planning her next steps. The ritual had been disrupted, the order thrown into disarray, but the horde's true location remained hidden. The box on the altar had been a decoy, she was certain to, small to contain the treasure described in the journal. The real hoard was elsewhere, and she was closer than ever to finding it. As she made her way back to the village, the night air cool against her flushed cheeks, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The Order of the Rune had underestimated her, as so many had before. They saw only an elderly spinster, a harmless old woman with a penchant for knitting and gossip. But she was more than that, a keen observer of human nature, a weaver of clues, a hunter of truth. Tonight, she had outwitted them, and the thrill of it coursed through her veins like a tonic. Back at her cottage, she locked the door and drew the curtains before examining the dagger by lamplight. Its blade was sharp, its hilt adorned with a single emerald that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She traced the runes with a careful finger, committing their shapes to memory. They were a language she didn't yet understand, but she would. Professor Hargreaves would help, and the journal, still safely hidden in her desk, held more secrets to unravel. As she sipped a cup of chamomile tea. Her mind replayed the night's events, the chant, the fire, Blackwood's rage, Eleanor's fanaticism. The order of the rune was desperate, their plans teetering on the edge of collapse. But desperation made people dangerous, and Miss Marple knew she'd need to tread carefully. The hoard was close, its secrets within reach, and she would not rest until she'd unraveled the final thread of this ancient, rune-etched scheme. She set the dagger on her table, its emerald catching the light, and leaned back in her chair. The clock struck 2, its chime soft but resolute, like the beating of her own determined heart. Tomorrow, she would dig deeper, following the clues to their inevitable end. For now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph, the satisfaction of a woman who had faced the shadows and emerged victorious if only for tonight. Chapter 9. The hoard revealed morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat, her knitting needles clicking softly. The journal from the manor lay open before her, its pages yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but legible. A cup of Earl Grey steamed beside her, its bergamot scent mingling with the faint mustiness of the old book. Outside, St. Mary Mead was waking Mrs. Price's collie barked at a passing bicycle, and the milkman's cart rattled down Chipping Lane. But Miss Marple's world was narrower, sharper, focused entirely on the cryptic words scrawled by a long-dead vicar. The Viking hoard, so tantalizingly close, was within her grasp, and she felt that familiar prickle of excitement, tempered by the caution of experience. She adjusted her spectacles and traced a finger over the journal's final entry, a dense paragraph of cryptic prose interspersed with runic symbols. The previous clues had led her through churchyards, manors, and forests, each step unveiling a piece of the puzzle. Now, the final clue stared back at her, stubborn and elusive. Where the village heart drinks deep, the hoard sleeps beneath. The stone that weeps. She murmured the words aloud, her voice soft but deliberate, testing their rhythm. The village heart. The well, of course St. Mary Mead's ancient well, tucked behind the greengrocer's shop, where generations had drawn water before modern pipes rendered it ornamental. But the stone that weeps, that required investigation. Miss Marple closed the journal and slipped it into her handbag, a practical black affair that had seen countless such quests. She donned her tweed coat and a sensible hat, its brim just wide enough to shield her eyes from the autumn sun. As she stepped outside, the crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and she paused to exchange pleasantries with Mrs. Bantry, who was pruning her roses with vigorous snips. Off on another adventure, Jane, Mrs. Bantry called, her cheeks rosy from the chill. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Just a walk, Dolly. The village well needs a bit of attention, I think. Mrs. Bantry raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, accustomed to her friend's cryptic errands. Miss Marple continued down the lane, her steps measured but purposeful. The well was a short walk, nestled in a small square where ivy clung to its weathered stones. She stood before it, hands clasped, studying the structure. The well was circular, its rim built of moss-covered limestone, with a wooden roof long since rotted away. A rusty bucket dangled from a frayed rope, and a faint drip echoed from within perhaps the weeping stone. She leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. The air was cool and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang. No ladder, no obvious access. She straightened, her mind racing. The journal had mentioned a chest, and the forest vault had yielded only artifacts, not the full hoard. The well, then, must conceal the true prize. But how to reach it? She needed help. Someone young, strong, and discreet. Her nephew, Raymond West, came to mind. He was in St. Mary Mead for a rare visit, escaping London's literary circles for a quiet weekend. His adventurous spirit and knack for mechanics would be perfect. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple telephoned Raymond at the Blue Borin, where he was staying. "Raymond, dear," she said, her voice warm but firm, "I need your assistance with a small matter. Could you meet me at the village well in an hour? Bring a torch and perhaps that crowbar you mentioned last summer." Raymond's voice crackled through the line, tinged with amusement. "Aunt Jane, are you chasing buried treasure again? I'll be there, but I expect a full explanation over tea. Tea and scones, dear," she promised, hanging up with a satisfied nod. She busied herself preparing a small satchel notebook, pencil, a measuring tape, and the journal. Just in case, her fingers lingered on the single gold coin she'd taken from the forest vault, its surface etched with a serpent coiled around a tree. It was heavy, warm to the touch, and undeniably Viking. She slipped it into her pocket. A talisman of her progress. At the well, Raymond arrived promptly, his lanky frame clad in a wool sweater and corduroys, a torch in one hand and a crowbar slung over his shoulder. His dark hair was slightly mussed, and his eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Right, Aunt Jane," he said, setting down his tools. "What's this about? You've got that look, the one that says you're 10 steps ahead of everyone else." Miss Marple chuckled, patting his arm. "Patience, Raymond. Let's just say the well may hold more than water. Help me examine the stones around the base." They knelt together, brushing away dirt and moss. Raymond's torch illuminated the well's foundation, revealing a ring of uneven stones, some cracked, others worn smooth by centuries. Miss Marple pointed to a slab slightly larger than the rest, its surface slick with moisture. "There," she said, "the weeping stone, perhaps." Raymond tapped it with the crowbar, producing a hollow thud. "Not solid," he murmured. "Clever. Old thing, aren't you?" He wedged the crowbar beneath the slab and heaved, muscles straining. The stone shifted, revealing a narrow gap. Miss Marple held the torch as Raymond pried further, exposing a dark cavity beneath. A gust of stale air rose, carrying the scent of earth and iron. "It's a passage," Raymond said, excitement creeping into his voice. "Aunt Jane, you've outdone yourself this time." "Not yet," she cautioned, though her heart quickened. "We must be careful." The journal spoke of traps. Raymond fetched a coil of rope from his car, and they rigged a makeshift harness. He insisted on descending first, citing his youth and her delicate constitution, which earned him a wry smile. "I'm not as frail as you think, dear," she said, but she let him go. holding the torch steady as he lowered himself into the well. The rope went taut, then slackened. "I'm down," Raymond called, his voice echoing. "It's a chamber stone walls, dry as a bone. There's a chest here, Aunt Jane, a big one." Miss Marple's pulse raced, but she kept her voice calm. "Describe it, Raymond." "Wooden, bound with iron, carved with those squiggly runes you mentioned. There's a lock, but it looks rusted. I'll try the crowbar." She waited, the drip of water marking the seconds. A metallic groan echoed up, followed by Raymond's triumphant shout. "Got it. Oh, Aunt Jane, you've got to see this." With Raymond's help, Miss Marple descended, her sensible shoes finding purchase on the rough stone walls. The chamber was small, no larger than her parlor, its walls etched with faded runes that glowed faintly under the torchlight. The chest stood open in the center, its lid splintered from Raymond's efforts. Inside, gold glinted coins, torques, and arm rings, all unmistakably Viking. Nestled among them were stone tablets, their surfaces covered in intricate runic script. Miss Marple knelt beside the chest, her fingers brushing a gold torque. "Magnificent," she whispered. "But the tablets, those are the key." She lifted one carefully, its weight surprising her. The runes were sharp, precise, unlike the weathered symbols on the forest stones. She traced a line, recalling Professor Hargreaves' lessons. "These aren't just decoration," she said. "They tell a story." Raymond grinned, holding up a coin. "A story worth a fortune, I'd wager. Shall we haul it up?" Before she could answer, a shadow flickered at the chamber's entrance. Miss Marple froze, her hand tightening on the tablet. Footsteps crunched above, deliberate and heavy. Raymond doused the torch, plunging them into darkness. "Stay quiet," he whispered, pulling her behind the chest. The footsteps stopped, and a voice low, menacing called down. "Miss Marple, I know you're there. Hand over the journal, and I'll let you walk away. Thomas Blackwood." Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together his presence. He'd followed her, perhaps from the forest, his greed outweighing his caution. She whispered to Raymond, "Keep him talking. I need time." Raymond cleared his throat, his voice steady. "Despite the tension, Blackwood, is it? Bit late for a stroll, don't you think? What's your game?" A harsh laugh echoed. "The hoard, you fool. It's mine by right. The Order's been guarding it for centuries, and I won't let an old spinster steal it." Miss Marple, hidden in the shadows, worked quickly. She slipped the journal from her satchel and tucked it into the chest. Replacing it with her notebook a decoy, she nudged Raymond, who caught her meaning. "All right, Blackwood," he called. "We've got the journal. Come down and take it." "If you're man enough." A rope creaked, and Blackwood descended, his silhouette bulky against the faint light from above. Raymond waited until he was halfway down, then lunged, grabbing the rope and yanking hard. Blackwood yelped, tumbling into the chamber with a thud. Miss Marple flicked on the torch, revealing his sprawled form, his face twisted in fury. "Raymond, dear," she said calmly, "fetch the police. I believe Mr. Blackwood has overstayed his welcome." Raymond scrambled up the rope, leaving Miss Marple to stand over Blackwood, torch in one hand, the gold coin in the other. "You underestimated me, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice mild but steely. "A common mistake." Blackwood lunged, but she stepped aside nimbly, and he crashed into the chest, scattering coins. She sked as if scolding a naughty child. Greed makes one so clumsy. Within minutes, Raymond returned with Constable Harris, a burly man who looked bemused but efficient. Blackwood was hauled up, handcuffed, and led away, muttering curses. Miss Marple and Raymond carefully secured the chest and tablets, rigging a pulley to lift them to the surface as they emerged into the evening light. Villagers gathered, drawn by the commotion. Whispers spread Miss Marple had found treasure. Back at her cottage, the chest sat in her parlour, guarded by Raymond and Constable Harris. Miss Marple poured tea, her hands steady despite the day's exertions. "The tablets," she said, "are the true treasure. I suspect they hold the final secret of the Whodunit curse. But something else." She spent the evening deciphering the runes, her knitting abandoned as she scribbled translations. The tablets spoke of a Viking chieftain, Sigurd, who buried the Horde not to curse his enemies, but to bless his descendants with prosperity. The curse was a myth spread by the order to deter thieves. Miss Marple smiled, satisfied. The Horde would go to a museum, its story preserved, but the tablets' message of peace resonated with her. Human nature, she mused, was predictable greed and fear, so often masked hope and generosity. As Raymond recounted the adventure to a wide-eyed Mrs. Bantry over scones, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already wandering to the tablets. Final riddle, a reference to a lost saga etched in stone beyond St. Mary Mead. She set her cup down, her eyes bright. The hoard was found, the scheme unravelled, but the promise of another mystery beckoned. Chapter 10. The curse unravelled. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy parlour in St. Mary Mead, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the familiar chintz curtains and polished mahogany table. The air was thick with the scent of lavender from a small vase on the mantel, and a tray of tea things sat untouched beside her favourite armchair. In her lap lay the runic tablets, their weathered surfaces edged with angular symbols that seemed to pulse with secrets older than the village itself. The Viking hoard, now safely stored in a locked chest at her feet, had been the talk of St. Mary Mead for days. But it was these tablets that held her attention now. The mystery was not yet fully unravelled, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes gleamed with the quiet determination that had carried her through 9 perilous chapters of this adventure. The tablets were unlike anything she had encountered before. Their edges were worn smooth by centuries, yet the carvings remained crisp, as if defying time's erosion. Professor Hargreaves had called them a linguistic marvel, but his academic enthusiasm had waned when Miss Marple pressed him for a translation. "Norse runes are tricky," he'd muttered, adjusting his spectacles. "They're not just letters, sometimes they're spells, or riddles, or both." That had been enough to set Miss Marple's mind alight. A riddle was, after all, merely a puzzle in disguise, and she had a knack for puzzles. She ran her fingers lightly over the first tablet, her thoughts drifting to the events of the past week. The village had buzzed with speculation since the police carted off Eleanor Grayson and Thomas Blackwood, their faces grim as they were led from the ancient stone circle. The Order of the Rune, that shadowy society Miss Marple had uncovered, had crumbled overnight, its members scattering like leaves in a storm. Yet the tablets, retrieved from the hoard beneath the village well, whispered of something more, a final secret that neither Eleanor nor Blackwood had fully grasped. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People often underestimated the power of quiet observation, but it was her greatest weapon. The clock on the mantel chimed 7:30, its delicate notes pulling her from her reverie. She set the tablets aside and reached for her knitting, the familiar click of needles a soothing counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The village tea party was tomorrow, a seemingly innocuous event that Miss Marple had orchestrated with care. It would be the perfect setting to reveal her findings, to lay bare the truth behind the so-called curse. But first, she needed to translate the tablets, and for that she required assistance. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky bruised with clouds, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Marple, dressed in her sensible tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single rose, made her way to the vicarage, where Professor Hargreaves was staying. The vicarage garden was a riot of late summer blooms, their colors muted by the overcast light. The professor greeted her at the door, his weary frame dwarfed by a voluminous cardigan that seemed to have been whereupon by someone with more enthusiasm than skill. "Jane, my dear," he exclaimed, ushering her inside. "I was just about to telephone you. Those tablets extraordinary. I've made some progress, but I confess, they're proving rather stubborn." Miss Marple settled into a worn armchair in the vicar's study, her eyes scanning the cluttered desk where Hargreaves had spread out his notes. Sketches of runes mingled with scribbled translations, and a magnifying glass lay atop a dog-eared copy of Norse mythology and its mysteries. She smiled politely. "I trust you found something of interest, Professor." "Oh, indeed." Hargreaves's eyes sparkled. "The runes are Elder Futhak, used by the Vikings round the 8th century. Most of the inscriptions are names likely, chieftains or warriors, but there's one tablet that's different. It's a narrative, Jane, a story. I've only deciphered fragments, but it speaks of a gift of peace and a binding oath. No mention of a curse, mind you. That's all superstitious nonsense, likely spread by that order of yours to keep people away." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "A gift of peace," she murmured. "That aligns with what I suspected. The Order believed the hoard was cursed, but perhaps they were guarding a different kind of treasure, one of knowledge. Not gold." Hargreaves raised an eyebrow. "Knowledge? You think these tablets are some sort of philosophical treatise?" "Perhaps," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "Or perhaps they're a message, meant to guide rather than destroy. Could you have the translation ready by this afternoon? The tea party is at 4, and I'd like to present our findings to the village." The professor hesitated, his fingers drumming on the desk. "It's a tall order, Jane, but I'll do my best. These runes are devilishly complex. Some symbols don't even appear in standard runic alphabets. but I'll have something for you by 3. Satisfied, Miss Marple rose, her handbag clutched in one gloved hand. Thank you, Professor. I'll see you at the tea party. And do bring the tablets. I have a feeling they'll make quite an impression. The village hall was a flurry of activity by mid-afternoon. Tables draped in white linen groaned under the weight of scones, sandwiches, and Victoria sponges, while the air hummed with the chatter of St. Mary Mead's residents. Miss Marple moved among them, her unassuming presence belying the sharpness of her observations. Mrs. Buntry, her old friend, was holding court near the tea urn, regaling a group with tales of her garden's prize roses. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was attempting to mediate a dispute between two parishioners over the placement of the raffle table. And in a corner, young Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, was deep in conversation with a local journalist, no doubt spinning the tale of the hoard's discovery into something suitably dramatic. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were drawn to a newcomer, a tall, angular woman in her 50s, dressed in a severe black frock that seemed out of place among the pastel cardigans and floral dresses. She stood alone, her hands clasped tightly around a teacup, her gaze darting nervously toward the door. Miss Marple recognized her at once. Clara Thorne, a distant cousin of Eleanor Grayson, who had arrived in the village only yesterday. Clara had not been part of the order, but her connection to Eleanor made her a figure of interest. Miss Marple filed the observation away, her mind already weaving a new thread into the tapestry of the mystery. At precisely 4 o'clock, Miss Marple tapped a spoon against her teacup, the delicate chime cutting through the din. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the slight, silver-haired woman who commanded their attention with an effortless authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I'm sure you've all heard about the recent excitement in our little village, the discovery of the Viking hoard beneath the well. It's been quite the adventure, hasn't it?" A ripple of laughter and murmurs of agreement greeted her words. "But today, I want to share the final piece of this puzzle. A piece that has been hidden for centuries, guarded by secrets and misunderstandings." She gestured to Professor Hargreaves, who stepped forward, clutching a sheaf of papers and the runic tablets. With the help of Professor Hargreaves, she continued, "We have translated the inscriptions on these tablets, found with the hoard. They tell a story not of curses or greed, but of peace and unity. You and peace, as it bound our people in times of strife. The true treasure is not gold, but the oath we swear to protect one another." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Miss Marple noted Clara Thorne's teacup trembling slightly in her hands. She continued, "The Order of the Rune, which some of you may have heard whispers about, believed the hoard was cursed. They guarded it zealously, using fear to keep others away. But they were mistaken. The tablets were meant to teach, not to terrify." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "The hoard itself, gold coins, a jeweled dagger, and other artifacts has been donated to the British Museum, where it will be studied and preserved. But the true value lies in these tablets, which remind us that even in the darkest times, there is hope for unity." The room erupted in applause, but Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on Clara Thorne, who had set her teacup down and was edging toward the door. With a polite excuse, Miss Marple slipped through the crowd, her steps light but purposeful. She caught up with Clara just outside the hall, where the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. "Miss Thorne," she said gently, "might I have a word?" Clara froze, her face pale. "Miss Marple, I was just stepping out for some." "Airy, of course," Miss Marple replied, her tone kind but unyielding. "But I couldn't help noticing your interest in the tablets. You're related to Eleanor Grayson, are you not?" Clara's lips tightened, but she nodded. "She's my cousin. I didn't know about the order, I swear. I only came to St. Mary Mead because Eleanor wrote to me months ago, before all this began. She said she'd found something valuable, something that could change everything." "I thought she meant money." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And did she mention the tablets?" Clara hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded letter. "She sent me this. It's why I came. I didn't want to cause trouble, but I needed to know what she meant." Miss Marple took the letter, her fingers brushing against the crisp paper. It was written in Eleanor's elegant hand, but the words were cryptic. "The runes hold the key to our legacy. Find them, and you'll understand." There was no mention of a curse, only a fervent plea for Clara to join her in St. Mary Mead. "Thank you, Miss Thorne," Miss Marple said, returning the letter. "You've been most helpful. I believe Eleanor wanted you to know the truth, not to perpetuate the Order's lies. Would you care to join us inside? The tea is quite excellent." Clara's shoulders relaxed, and she managed a small smile. "I'd like that." The rain was falling in earnest by the time the tea party ended, but Miss Marple's spirits were undampened. She walked home with Raymond, who carried an umbrella and a grin that suggested he was already planning his next novel. "Aunt Jane," he said, "you've outdone yourself this time. A Viking horde, a secret society, and a blessing disguised as a curse. It's positively Shakespearean." Miss Marple chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, Raymond, it's just human nature. People see what they want to see, curses where there are blessings, enemies where there are friends. The trick is to look a little closer." Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair, the tablets once again in her lap. The mystery was resolved, the hoard safely in the hands of scholars, and the order of the rune a footnote in St. Mary Mead's history. Yet, as she sipped her tea, her gaze lingered on the runes, their shapes dancing in the lamplight. There was always another puzzle, another thread to unravel, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet observation and unerring instinct, was ready for whatever came next.